Hey, welcome back. Pull up your blanket, get comfortable, and let me tell you something wild before we even begin tonight. Somewhere in the year 1692, one of the most powerful men in the world woke up at 8 in the morning and could not get out of bed until roughly 100 people had watched him do it. Not metaphorically, literally. 100 people, watching him get dressed, watching him get shaved, watching him eat his breakfast, and every single one of those people considered it an honor to be there. Now here is the part that really gets me. This man was not embarrassed. He was not uncomfortable. He was not trying to get them to leave. He had engineered the whole thing, and before the night was over, you are going to understand exactly why, and why the story of powder, perfume, and pride might be the most unexpectedly fascinating window into human nature that history has ever quietly left sitting on the shelf. If you've been enjoying these stories with me, you already know how much I love finding the things history forgot to shout about. The quiet, strange, deeply human details tucked inside centuries we think we already understand. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you stay. And if tonight's story moves something in you, or makes you smile, or makes you text someone tomorrow saying you will not believe what men used to do in the 1700s, I would absolutely love it if you hit that like button, shared this video, and maybe subscribe to come back for the next one. Not because of numbers, but because it genuinely helps me keep telling these stories. And hey, drop a comment down below. Tell me where you are right now. Are you in bed already on the couch? Is someone sleeping next to you who has no idea you're currently learning about men who wore 2 pounds of flour on their heads? I want to know. Now, soft light, slow breath, maybe a little fan humming in the background. Let us begin. The year is 1682, and the man standing at the center of the most talked about building in the world is not a warrior. He is not scarred, not rough, not smelling of iron and horses. He is wearing heels. He's wearing a wig. He's wearing more perfume than most flower shops carry on a Tuesday. And at this very moment, he is the single most feared and admired person in all of Europe. His name is Louis XIV of France, and he has just moved his entire royal court, several thousand people, into a palace so deliberately, almost aggressively beautiful, that foreign ambassadors would reportedly walk through its halls and lose the ability to form sentences. Versailles. Now I want you to really sit with this image for a second, because I think we have a habit of picturing the past as something quaint, something smaller than us, something that belonged to simpler people who just had not figured things out yet. Louis XIV was not simpler than us. He was by almost any historical measure one of the most strategically brilliant men who ever sat on a throne. He ruled France for 72 years longer than any monarch in the history of a major European country. He centralized power so completely that he is often credited with essentially inventing the modern concept of the nation-state. The memorialist, the Duke of Saint-Simon, who watched him every single day, once wrote that, "With an almanac and a watch, one could say from 300 leagues away exactly what Louis was doing at any given moment, because his day ran, quote, like clockwork." And that clockwork, it started in a bedroom. Every morning at 8:15, the king's valet entered the royal bedchamber. He would pour a small drop of wine over the king's hands, a ritual cleansing delicate and precise. A chamberlain arrived with holy water. The king made the sign of the cross. A miniature private mass was held right there at the bedside, and then the doors began to open. First, the most privileged few, the people who had earned, or in some cases paid good money for the right to stand in the same room as a half-awake king. Then more. Then the Grand Chamberlain. Then the barbers. Then the physicians. Then gradually around 100 people standing in the candlelight of the royal bedroom, watching the most powerful man in France be washed, shaved, coiffed, and dressed. This ceremony had a name. The French called it le lever, the rising. And it was not accidental. It was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. Think about it from Lewis's point of view. You are an absolute monarch. Your power rests entirely on your ability to make people believe you are above them, different from them, almost divine in some unspoken, unquestioned way. In a pre-television, pre-internet world, how do you project that? How do you make sure everyone from the Duke of Burgundy to the Ambassador of Spain understands in their bones that you are not like other men? You make watching you get dressed into a privilege. You make proximity to your morning routine into a form of currency. And here is the part that still astonishes me when I think about it. It worked. Completely. Aristocrats who were not invited to the lever worried. They lost sleep over it. They sent letters asking why they had not been included. Because being excluded from the bedchamber of Louis XIV meant you were losing influence. It meant you were becoming invisible. And in the court of Versailles, invisible was the most dangerous thing a person could be. Between 3,000 and 10,000 people lived inside Versailles at any given time, not visiting, living there. Nobles who had estates of their own across France were required to spend large portions of the year at court, because if Louis noticed you were absent, as one contemporary source put it, your chances for advancement could quietly, permanently evaporate. So they stayed, and they watched him get dressed, and they considered it a gift. Now here is where the powder and the perfume come in, because this was not just about ceremony for ceremony's sake. The look of these men, Louis, his courtiers, and eventually gentlemen across all of England, Germany, the Netherlands, the American colonies, was very deliberately, very carefully constructed to communicate something. White skin meant you did not work outside. It meant the sun had never touched your face with labour. It meant you were quite literally above the kind of life that required you to stand in a field. Powder meant refinement. The fine-scented starch dusted onto wigs made from wheat flour or rice flour infused with orris root and lavender was not just aesthetic. It was a statement. It said, I have so much that I can afford to use food to style my hair. And perfume was something else entirely. Versailles under Louis XIV was nicknamed La Cour Parfumée, the perfumed court. Every day courtiers were expected to wear a different scent. Not the same one, a different one. Roses on Monday, jasmine on Tuesday, violet on Wednesday. The king himself had preferences, and if you wore the wrong thing into the wrong room on the wrong day, people noticed. The perfume you wore was not personal preference. It was a social signal as legible and as loaded as the cut of your coat or the height of your wig. And speaking of wigs, the full-bottomed periwig, that magnificent, slightly absurd cascade of curls falling past the shoulders, was not something men chose because they thought it looked natural. Nobody thought it looked natural. That was rather the point. It was an artifact, an announcement, a declaration that said, I have enough leisure, enough wealth, and enough servants to maintain something this impractical on my head every single day. An everyday wig in London cost around 25 shillings. That was a full week's wages for a common labourer. A truly fine wig, the kind worn by judges, lords, and men who wanted to make an impression, cost considerably more, and they needed to be regularly sent to wigmakers for cleaning, restyling, and what was delicately described as delousing, because the combination of animal fat pomade, wheat starch, and a warm human head was, shall we say, an attractive environment for small unwanted visitors. By the early 1700s, Paris alone had more than 1,200 wig shops, providing a livelihood for around 6,000 people. 6,000 people, employed exclusively to maintain the hair of men who wanted to look powerful. This was not vanity in the way we sometimes lazily use that word as a small silly thing. This was vanity as architecture, vanity as statecraft, vanity as a very sophisticated, very intentional language that an entire civilization had developed to communicate who mattered and how much. Now, I think the reason this whole world feels so strange to us today is that somewhere between the 1700s and right now we made a collective decision, mostly in the West, mostly among men, that caring about your appearance was a sign of weakness. That powder and perfume and beautiful clothes were feminine things, and that masculinity meant not caring, or at least pretending not to. But here is the thing. The men who wore these wigs, the men who spent hours in powder rooms having their hair dressed, the men who selected their perfume with the same strategic care a modern executive chooses which watch to wear to a board meeting. These men negotiated treaties that changed the borders of nations. They commanded armies that determined the fate of millions. They wrote the documents and debated the ideas that became the foundation of modern democracy. Benjamin Franklin walked into the salons of Paris in 1778, wearing a simple American hat and a plain coat, and he was considered radical precisely because he had chosen to contrast himself against a world of velvet and powder. The contrast only worked because the standard was so elaborate. Franklin knew exactly what he was doing. He was speaking the same visual language, just with a different accent. And George Washington, whose face we know from 100 paintings, white-haired and dignified, never wore a wig at all. What you're seeing in those portraits is his own red hair powdered white. Because by the time Washington was in his prime, wigs were already beginning their slow exit. But the powder remained. Because the powder still said something, it still spoke. The world of powder and perfume was not a world of men who had forgotten themselves. It was a world of men who understood with extraordinary clarity that how you presented yourself to the world was a form of communication, that the surface was not separate from the substance, that a well-dressed man in the right room wearing the right scent with the right wig at exactly the right height above his eyebrows, the famous four-finger rule, by the way, which held that a wig placed too low made you look uneducated and too high made you look foolish, was a man who controlled his own story. They were not less serious because they cared about beauty. They were in many cases more serious because of it. And this is just the beginning of what I want to share with you tonight. Because underneath all that powder and perfume, underneath the wigs and the rouge and the beauty patches, there is a story about disease and deception, about politics and flour shortages, about the strange dark industry that fed this beautiful machine, and about how one tax in England and one revolution in France ended an entire era of masculine elegance almost overnight. The man at the centre of it all started losing his hair at 17. He was embarrassed. He hired 48 wig makers, and accidentally in doing so he changed the way every gentleman in the Western world would dress for the next 100 years. That story's coming up next, and I promise it is even stranger than it sounds. So let me take you somewhere a little darker now. Not the candlelit gilded halls of Versailles, not the powder rooms and the ceremony. Somewhere quieter, more uncomfortable, somewhere history usually tries to look away from. Because here is the thing nobody in polite company ever wanted to admit out loud. The most iconic fashion trend of the entire 18th century. The thing we associate with elegance, intellect, power, and refinement began with a disease. A deeply stigmatized, widely misunderstood, and genuinely terrifying disease that had been burning through Europe like a slow fire for nearly 200 years before Louis XIV ever sat on his throne. And if you've ever wondered why a king would hire 48 wig makers when he was only 17 years old, this is the story you've been waiting for. Let us go back even further than Versailles. Let's go back to 1495. That year, the armies of King Charles VIII of France marched into Naples during the first of the Italian Wars. It was a military campaign, a political power play, standard stuff for the period. But something came back from Naples with these soldiers that no general had planned for, no diplomat had accounted for, and no physician in Europe had ever seen quite like this before. A new disease, or at least a newly virulent, newly devastating form of one. The symptoms, as recorded by a German physician named Joseph Grünpeck, who contracted the illness himself in the early 1500s, were described in terms that still make uncomfortable reading. Ulcers, rashes covering the entire body, agonizing joint pain, and in the later stages something that destroyed the mind itself, hallucinations, confusion, a slow unravelling of everything that made a person who they were. Grünpeck wrote that he knew of nothing on earth so terrible, so cruel, so disgusting. The disease spread with shocking speed. By 1580, according to the surgeon William Close, and as he put it, infinite multitude of patients were filling London's hospitals, with more arriving every single day. Historians have noted that by that point this illness had become the worst epidemic to strike Europe since the Black Death. And unlike the Black Death, which killed its victims quickly and terribly, this one could take decades. A person might walk around appearing healthy for years, spreading the infection without knowing it, while the disease quietly worked its way deeper and deeper into their body. In Naples, they called it the French disease. In France, naturally, they called it the Neapolitan disease. In Germany, it was the French pox. Everywhere it arrived, people named it after somewhere else, which tells you everything you need to know about how much shame was attached to it. We know it today as syphilis. Now, one of the cruelest things about this disease in the context of that particular century was what it did to hair. In an era when a full, thick, healthy head of hair was considered one of the most visible markers of virility and status, in a man, syphilis caused patchy, progressive, sometimes total hair loss. Not gradually and gracefully the way age might thin a man's temples. Suddenly, in clumps, in ways that were impossible to hide and impossible to explain away without essentially confessing to something the church, the courts, and polite society all considered deeply shameful. The diarist Samuel Pepys, one of the most candid and fascinating record keepers of 17th century London, wrote about his own brother's illness with a kind of helpless dread that cuts right through the centuries. He wrote in his diary that if his brother survived, he would not be able to show his head, that Pepys noted would be a very great shame to him. Think about what that means. Not my brother is suffering, not I am frightened for his health. The first thought recorded honestly and privately in a personal diary was about the head, about the hair, about what the visible loss of hair would announce to the world. That was the social reality. Baldness in that world did not just suggest age. It announced infection. An infection announced the kind of life that respectable men were not supposed to be leading. So what did people do? They covered up, quite literally. Wigs made from horse hair, goat hair, and sometimes human hair were already in existence as a purely practical solution for men who had lost their natural hair for various reasons. But they were not fashionable. They were not elegant. They were, as one historian put it quite bluntly, a shameful necessity. And then this is the moment everything changed. In 1655, the King of France started losing his hair. Louis XIV was 17 years old. Now historians are careful to note that his hair loss was consistent with early syphilitic symptoms, and that when his body was examined after his death at the age of 76, it was, as contemporary accounts recorded, riddled with the disease. Whether the hair loss at 17 was directly caused by the infection or by the mercury treatments physicians were administering, and we will get to the mercury in just a moment, because that is its own particular horror we cannot say with absolute certainty. What we can say is that the young king was losing his hair, he was humiliated by it, and he had the resources to do something about it that no ordinary man could ever dream of. He hired 48 wig makers, not one, not three, 48. A personal staff of wig makers whose entire professional purpose was to ensure that the King of France always had access to a full, magnificent, immaculately styled head of hair. Every morning 5 wigs were brought to the king for inspection, so that he could choose which one suited his mood and the day's engagements. His personal wigmaker, a man named Georges Binet, reportedly declared with the slightly unhinged enthusiasm of someone who has truly found his calling that he would strip the heads of every French subject in the kingdom, if that was what it took to keep the king's head properly covered. And here is the pivot, the exact moment where shame became style. When a king does something, his courtiers do not ask why. They simply do it too. Within months of Louis adopting his elaborate wigs, every ambitious nobleman at Versailles had one. Within a few years, the fashion had crossed the Channel. Within a decade, it had spread across Germany, the Netherlands, the Italian states, and beyond. By the time it reached the American colonies in the early 1700s, the political and medical origins had been so thoroughly buried under layers of etiquette, prestige, and fashion that most people wearing them had no idea why the trend had started in the first place. The wig had completed the most extraordinary journey in fashion history, from medical cover-up to status symbol to mandatory accessory for anyone who considered themselves civilized. But let's pause here for a moment, because I think there is something genuinely worth sitting with: the mercury treatment. Because the disease itself was only half of the hair loss story. Physicians in the 16th and 17th centuries had essentially one tool for treating this illness, and that tool was mercury. Mercury applied as an ointment rubbed directly onto the skin. Mercury administered as steam, with patients enclosed in sealed boxes or chambers, while the vapour filled the space around them. Mercury swallowed in pills. Mercury injected. The logic behind it, and there was a logic however brutal, was that mercury caused the body to sweat and salivate profusely, and physicians believed this was purging the illness out through the pores. The side effects were, to put it as plainly as possible, catastrophic: gum ulcers, loose teeth that fell out entirely, nerve damage, kidney failure, and yes, accelerated complete hair loss. There was a saying that circulated through European society for centuries, repeated so often it became almost darkly comedic: one night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. So men were losing their hair both to the disease and to the treatment for the disease, and in a world with no antibiotics, no understanding of bacterial infection, and no realistic prospect of a cure, the wig was not a vanity. It was a survival strategy, a way of continuing to function in a society that would have destroyed your reputation, your career, and your social standing the moment your scalp betrayed what your body was going through. I find something genuinely moving about that, actually. Not romantic, none of this was romantic, but human, deeply recognizably human. The lengths people will go to in order to maintain dignity when the world has decided that their suffering is something to be ashamed of. Now across the English Channel, a very similar story was playing out on a slightly different timeline. King Charles II of England had spent years in exile in France after his father was executed in 1649, and when he returned to claim his throne in 1660, he brought French fashion with him, including the periwig. Charles, unlike Louis, reportedly began wearing wigs not to hide baldness, but to hide the first appearance of grey hair. His hair had begun to turn prematurely, and like his French cousin, both conditions consistent with late-stage syphilis. Though historians are careful to note this has not been definitively proven, for every case he was not prepared to let the world see it. What happened next was almost comically fast by the standards of fashion history. By 1663, just 3 years after Charles had introduced the wig to the English court, Samuel Pepys, our ever-alert, ever-honest diarist, went to his wig-maker, had his own hair cut off, and recorded the experience with the slightly bewildered tone of a man who is not entirely sure how he ended up here. He paid £3 for his first periwig, which was his own hair restyled. He wrote that parting with his hair went as he put it a little to his heart at the time. Then he went to church the following Sunday, braced for everyone to stare, and found to his surprise that nobody much cared. He was relieved. He was fashionable. He was for the first time in his life wearing the kind of hair that kings wore. There is something almost touching about that particular diary entry. Here is a man who has essentially bought his way into the visual language of power with £3 and a trip to the barber, and he is walking into church hoping nobody notices when in fact, what he has done is exactly what the fashion was designed to make him do. Signal status, signal belonging, signal that he was the kind of man who kept up with the world. And then there is the plague complication, which is one of my favourite tiny historical details, and I think it perfectly captures the particular anxiety of living in that century. In September of 1665, London was in the grip of a devastating outbreak. Pepys had purchased a new periwig some time before, but he had not worn it, and in his diary he recorded exactly why, in a passage that manages to be both grimly practical and somehow rather poignant. He had bought it, he wrote, but dared not wear it, because the plague was in Westminster when he had purchased it. And he wondered aloud what would become of the fashion when the plague was over, because nobody, he reasoned, would dare buy hair any more for fear of infection. That it might have been cut from the heads of people who had died of the plague. He eventually decided enough time had passed that the wig was probably safe. He wore it. The anxiety was not unreasonable. The wig trade depended on a supply of human hair, and that supply came from wherever it could be found. We will talk more about the dark machinery behind that supply in a later part of our story tonight. For now, what I want you to hold on to is this image: a well-dressed London gentleman sitting in his fine-coloured silk suit, holding a new wig, genuinely uncertain whether the hair on it had come from a plague victim, and putting it on anyway. Because fashion, it turns out, has never been entirely separate from the darker currents of the world it belongs to. It absorbs them, it transforms them, it takes the uncomfortable truth and covers it with powder and perfume and a magnificent cascade of curls, until the original story is almost completely invisible. Almost. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before we move on, and it is something I think about every time I look at a portrait of a bewigged 18th century gentleman staring out of a gilded frame with absolute, impeccable, unreadable composure. By the time the periwig had fully conquered European fashion by the early 1700s, when wearing one was not just common, but essentially mandatory in any professional or social setting of significance, the disease that had created it had become so widespread in the upper classes that a letter written by Princess Palatine Elizabeth Charlotte, the sister-in-law of Louis XIV himself, described a lunch attended by 9 people of quality. Of those 9 people, she wrote with what reads as genuine horror, 7 had the French disease. 7 out of 9. She called it dreadful. And she was right. But she was also describing a world in which those 7 people had gone to lunch, sat at a table, made conversation, and looked in their wigs and their powder and their perfectly constructed clothes exactly like everyone else in the room. That is what fashion does in the end. It creates a shared surface. A common story that everyone agrees to tell together, whatever the private truth might be beneath it. The wig was not a lie exactly. It was a very elegant, very expensive, very carefully maintained agreement not to ask certain questions. And that agreement, that unspoken social contract written in hair and powder, was about to get far more elaborate, far more technically sophisticated, and frankly far more bizarre than anything we have covered so far. Because once the fashion was established, the real question became, how do you actually make it work every single day? What goes into a wig? What holds it together? What makes it smell like a garden instead of a butcher shop? And what happens when it goes wrong? The answers involve animal fat wheat flour and a dedicated room in your house specifically for the mess. And they are coming up right now, right? So you now know why the wig existed. But knowing why something exists and understanding what it actually felt like to live inside it every single morning of your life, those are two entirely different things. And what I want to do in this part of our story is take you into the powder room. Not the polite, polished version you see in portraits, the real one. The one with the bellows and the animal fat and the paper cone over the face and the valet working quietly in a cloud of scented starch, while a gentleman sits perfectly still for upward of an hour waiting to be made presentable. Because honestly, the daily mechanics of maintaining this look were so elaborate, so chemically interesting, and in places so quietly absurd that I think they tell us more about this world than almost any political document or royal decree ever could. Let us start with the pomatum. Pomatum, or pomade as we would say now, was the foundation of everything. Without it, the powder went nowhere. Without it, the whole carefully constructed visual of the white wig simply fell apart. And it was made from something that would give most people today considerable pause: animal fat. Specifically rendered lard beef marrow mutton tallow, or sometimes bear grease depending on what your wig maker had access to and what your budget allowed. These fats were boiled down, clarified and combined with aromatic ingredients to produce a thick, waxy paste, with a texture somewhere between cold butter and modern hair gel. The word pomatum itself comes from the Latin word for apple pomum because early recipes incorporated mashed rosewater boiled apples into the mixture, sometimes as many as 16 of them at a time, combined with a pound of sheep fat and a pound of pig fat, and then blended with fragrance oils of bergamot, rosewood, bay leaves, or jasmine. Take a moment to really picture what that meant in practice. Every morning a valet or personal barber would place the wig on a wooden styling block, a smooth, rounded form roughly the shape of a human head, and work the previous day's dried-out pomatum and stale powder from the hair using stiff-bristled hog-hair brushes, the kind with bristles firm enough to scrub crusted grease from mesh without tearing the delicate foundation of the wig. Then fresh pomatum were applied, coating every curl, every lock, every woven strand in a tacky, slightly gleaming layer of scented animal fat. And then came the powder. Now I want to ask you something. When you picture a powdered wig, what do you imagine the powder is made of? Most people assume it is some kind of refined cosmetic starch, perhaps perfumed and processed. Something purpose-built for the head. The answer is both more interesting and, depending on your perspective, more troubling than that. The cheapest powder was simply wheat flour, finely milled but fundamentally the same substance that was being used to bake bread on the other side of the city. The wealthier end of the market favoured more refined starches, processed potato or wheat starch ground to a finer consistency, which held its shape better in damp weather and produced a smoother, more even finish. The very finest powders added ground cuttlefish bone and calcined sheep bone, which acted as tiny reflective particles that made the wig catch candlelight in a particularly brilliant way, like something between a white wig and a very subtle halo. To mask the smell of rancid animal fat, which, as you might imagine, was an issue, the powders were heavily perfumed. Orris root, which smells of violets, lavender, clove, citrus oils, nutmeg, ambergris in the very finest blends. One period description notes that a properly dressed gentleman walking through a room smelled as though he had recently wandered through a botanical garden. Whether that was a fully accurate description or optimistic marketing, I will leave for you to decide. The colour, by the way, was not always white. Bright white was primarily a men's fashion. Women's powder more commonly came in charcoal grey, pale blue, or occasionally soft pink colours that complemented the complexion and the fashionable pallor of pale skin. The powders were kept dry in airtight containers made from, and this is a detail I genuinely love, pig bladders. Stretched, dried, tied off and used as natural airtight storage bags because dampness was the absolute enemy of starch, and a ruined powder tin meant a ruined morning. The application itself was a small performance. A designated space in the house, the powder room or powder closet, was set aside specifically for this ritual. We still use the term powder room today casually without thinking twice about where it came from. In grand aristocratic houses, this was a dedicated chamber. In smaller homes, it might be a closet sometimes barely large enough for one person to sit in. Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century writer and lexicographer, had a set of double doors off his parlour in Gough Square in London that led directly to his powdering closet, a room where he stored his wigs on their wooden blocks and sat to have the powder applied without spreading it across the rest of the house. At the ladies of Llangollen's home in Wales, the powder closet was so small that it worked on an extraordinary system. The person being powdered sat inside the closet on a chair, while the hairdresser stood outside and applied the powder through a large circular hole cut in the door. A hole in the door. I find that image inexplicably delightful. There is something almost ceremonially absurd about it, the formal preparation for social life requiring a person to sit in a closet with their head sticking through a wall, while someone on the other side puffs flour at them, and the application itself was equally choreographed. To protect the gentleman's face from inhaling fine particulate matter or getting it in his eyes, a large funnel-shaped cone of stiff paper was placed over the face with glass eye holes cut in so the wearer could see. Then the valet aimed the powder bellows, a hand-pump device specifically designed for this purpose, upward into the air above the wig, releasing a fine cloud of scented starch that cascaded down like a soft indoor snowfall, settling evenly into the pomatum-coated hair. The starch adhered to the fat, creating a sealed opaque coating that dried into the stiff sculptural finish you see in portraits. 1 pound of powder per dressing was typical. On occasions of particular ceremony, 2 pounds might be used, the excess drifting gently down to coat the shoulders, the furniture, and anything else in the vicinity. The whole process from combing out to final dressing could take an hour or more every morning. Can we stop for a second and just think about what that means? A man of status in the 18th century was, by cultural expectation, spending somewhere between 1 and 2 hours of every single morning in a dedicated room, having an elaborate chemistry experiment performed on his head by a trained professional. Before he had eaten breakfast, before he'd read a letter, before he'd spoken to his children or begun any work of the day. And none of this struck anyone in that world as unusual. It was simply the price of being who you were, or more precisely of being seen as who you were. There is something I want to say about that because I think it matters. We often describe this era as frivolous, as obsessed with surfaces at the expense of substance. But the men who submitted to this ritual every morning were not confused about what mattered. They were in their own framework, being absolutely precise about it. The surface was the substance. The presentation was the communication. In a world without photography, without mass media, without any of the modern tools we use to project an identity across distance and time, the only image you had was the one your physical presence created in the room. Get that wrong and you got everything wrong. Now, the rules around how to get it right were considerably more detailed than you might expect. Take wig placement alone. It was not simply a matter of centering the wig on your head and hoping for the best. There was a specific rule observed across courts and drawing rooms and professional offices from Paris to Philadelphia. The front edge of the wig should sit exactly 4 finger widths above the eyebrows. Not 3, not 5, 4. Any lower and you looked uneducated. Any higher and you looked faintly ridiculous. The 4-finger rule was not written down in a single etiquette manual, and formally published it. Was absorbed, observed, corrected by valets and friends and disapproving older relatives until it became second nature. It was in essence an unspoken test. Get it right and nobody noticed. Get it wrong and people noticed. and getting it wrong in a room full of people who had spent decades training themselves to notice exactly this kind of thing was, to put it plainly, not a minor social error. There were also the mice. This is perhaps my favourite footnote to the entire elaborate machinery of the powder room, and I include it with some affection, because it perfectly captures the gap between the elegant visual idea and the considerably less elegant reality. A full-bottomed periwig saturated with pomatum and powder could weigh upward of 2 pounds. 2 pounds of human or horse or goat hair layered in grease and scented starch, stored overnight on a wooden block in the corner of the bedchamber or dressing room, and the combination of apple-infused animal fat and fragrant wheat starch, it turns out, was also an excellent attractant for mice. Historical sources record that it was not at all uncommon, particularly in older or less well-maintained households, for a gentleman's wig to be discovered in the morning, with evidence that small rodents had been actively enjoying it overnight. Now, I want you to try to hold this image in your mind alongside the portrait of the composed, impeccably presented 18th century statesman staring out from the gold frame. Same man, same wig, one in the portrait, one on the wooden block at 3 a.m. with a mouse in it. Both are true. Both are necessary to understand the full picture. Beyond the daily ritual, wigs required periodic deep cleaning, and this was an entirely different level of intervention. You did not clean a wig at home. You sent it to the wig maker, who would boil it. Literally boil it in water hot enough to strip away months of accumulated fat and starch, kill anything living in the hair, and begin the process of restoring the piece to something workable. After boiling, the wet hair had to be rolled onto baked clay curlers, cylindrical pieces of fired earthenware, some of which archaeologists have recovered from sites like George Washington's Ferry Farm in Virginia, where more than 200 of these curlers were found wrapped in paper and left to dry before the recuring and redressing process could begin. The turnaround time at a good wig maker was a matter of days, which meant, of course, that a man of standing needed multiple wigs, not because he was extravagant, but because the maintenance schedule demanded it. You needed one to wear one being cleaned, and ideally one in reserve. Affluent households kept separate wigs for different occasions, a formal wig for court appearances, a lighter, everyday wig for domestic life, a travelling wig for road journeys, and in some households a mourning wig plain and undressed for funerals and periods of formal grief. Wigs had a life cycle, a maintenance schedule, a whole ecology of support around them, and this ecology supported thousands of people: the wig makers, the barbers, the powder suppliers, the perfumers, the clay curler makers, the valets trained in the ritual. All of them dependent on the social agreement that a gentleman's head was never under any acceptable circumstances to be seen in its natural state. Which brings me to perhaps the most unexpectedly dramatic chapter in the whole daily story of the wig, and one I find myself returning to whenever I think about how seriously this world took its own rules: wig theft. By the mid-18th century, a fine human hair wig was worth somewhere between 30 and 50 guineas for a high-quality piece. Translated to modern purchasing power, that is somewhere in the range of several $1,000s. Expensive enough to steal. Expensive enough to make stealing a calculated enterprise rather than an opportunistic snatch. And people were absolutely calculating about it. In London, a class of thieves known as chiving lays developed a specific specialty. They lurked behind hackney coaches, the slow-moving hired carriages of the city, and used sharp blades to slice through the leather back panel of the coach reach inside and remove the wig from the passenger's head without ever being seen. By the time the startled gentleman had registered what had happened, the thief was gone into the crowd. Then there were the small boys. Entrepreneurs of a particular kind trained their assistants to hide inside large wicker baskets carried on a man's shoulders disguised as a tradesman. As the carrier walked past wealthy pedestrians in a crowded market, the boy inside would silently lift the lid, reach up and take the wig from the head of someone nearby, drop back inside and close the lid, all in a matter of seconds, and then in a detail so specific it reads like something from a film. There were the trained monkeys. Yes, actual monkeys perched on walls or window ledges above crowded streets that had been taught to reach down and snatch wigs from heads below as their owners passed. I understand this sounds implausible. Historical engravings of the period depict it directly. One famous illustration from 1776 shows an elaborately dressed woman walking past an orchard wall, her towering wig suddenly lifted from her head by a monkey seated on the stone above her. The expression of the monkey is, if I am reading it correctly, one of complete professional satisfaction. Even highwaymen on country roads got in on it. Records from the period describe the highwayman John Everett, who did not simply steal a wig from a Quaker traveller seated in a coach, he swapped it. He pulled the Quaker's wig from his head and replaced it with his own inferior second-hand model, perhaps calculating that a visible swap was somehow more polite than a simple theft, or perhaps, and I rather hope this is the case, because he genuinely wanted the better wig and had the brass to trade for it at sword point. Records from the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court going back to the 1670s are peppered with testimonies from wig theft cases, victims describing their losses with the particular wounded dignity of a man whose most expensive portable possession has been removed from his head in broad daylight. What strikes me about all of this, the pomatum, the powder, bellows, the mice, the four-finger rule, the men hiding in baskets, is how completely, how totally committed this entire civilization was to the performance. Not just the kings and the dukes, the merchants, the physicians, the judges, the American colonists in New England loading their hair with pomatum and frizzling it into curls before walking to a business meeting. The publisher described in a Boston newspaper in 1792, spotted going about his daily errands in a pea-green coat, white vest, silver buckle shoes, and hair, quote, well loaded with pomatum, frizzled or crepered and powdered. This was not an elite affectation by the end of the 18th century. It was simply what a respectable man looked like. Not to conform was not just eccentric, it was, as one period source put it, bluntly a breach of social etiquette. The powder was not optional. It was the uniform of civilization, until of course it wasn't anymore. But before we get to the spectacular unravelling, and it was spectacular, and it happened faster than almost anyone expected, and the reasons behind it were far more than just fashion, there is one part of this world we've not yet looked at directly: the face beneath the wig. Because the powder room was only where it started. Once the wig was dressed and placed with exactly 4 fingers of clearance above the brows, a gentleman of the 18th century still had a face to attend to, and what men were doing to their faces in this era, the rouge, the patches, the lead paint, the eye-arching and the beauty marks, is a story so strange, so layered with vanity and poison and genuine tragedy, that it deserves its own time. And that is exactly where we are headed next. Picture this for a moment. A gentleman in Paris, 1750-something. He has spent the better part of an hour in the powder room. His wig is dressed, scented, and sitting at exactly the right height above his brows. He's ready to be seen. But before he steps through the door, he sits back down in front of the mirror and picks up something that looks to modern eyes utterly startling. A pot of white paint, a pot of crimson rouge, and a small velvet box containing 6 tiny black shapes cut from silk little moons, stars and circles, each one gummed on one side and ready to be pressed onto the skin. He is not a woman. He is a man of standing, of education, of considerable political influence. And he's about to paint his face. Not because he is hiding something shameful. not because he has lost a bet, because this is simply what it looks like to be well dressed in his world, and he's never questioned it for a single day of his adult life. Here is something I find genuinely fascinating about the 18th century. We tend to think of it as the age of reason, the era of Voltaire and Rousseau, of scientific inquiry and rational thought, of men gathering in coffee houses to debate ideas with cool analytical precision. And all of that is true, and those exact same men went home and painted their faces white before dinner. The contradiction is not as strange as it sounds once you understand the logic, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because the story of cosmetics in this era is not really about vanity in the way we usually mean that word. It is about something much more interesting, the way a culture constructs the face it wants to show the world, and the price, sometimes quite literally, it is willing to pay to maintain that construction. The foundation of everything in both France and England was white skin. Pale porcelain, absolutely bloodless white. Not a natural white, not even a healthy white, but an opaque, almost theatrical white that erased every trace of colour from the face and turned the complexion into something close to blank canvas. The visual logic was simple and brutal. Dark or tanned skin meant you worked outside. It meant fieldwork, labour, sun exposure, poverty. White skin announced that you had never, not once in your life, needed to stand in a field. The substance used to achieve this was called cerusse or blanc, essentially a paste made from white lead. The recipe has survived in period sources, and it is not for the faint-hearted. You took several thin plates of lead, steeped them in a pot of vinegar, and rested the pot in a bed of horse manure for at least 3 weeks. The heat of the fermenting manure accelerated the chemical reaction between the lead and the acidic vapour of the vinegar, causing the lead to oxidize and turn into a flaky white powder lead carbonate combined with lead hydroxide. You then ground this powder fine, mixed it with water and fragrance, and applied it to the face, neck and bosom in a thick, smooth layer. It produced a remarkable effect. Research done in recent years by scientists actually recreating these historical recipes has confirmed what contemporary portraits suggest: the white lead paint genuinely worked. It increased the reflectance of the skin, blurring blemishes and fine lines in a way that is not entirely unlike what a modern soft focus foundation attempts to do. Under candlelight particularly, it gave the face a luminous, almost otherworldly glow. People in that room in that light really did look like living porcelain. The problem was what it did on the way to that effect. Lead absorbed through the skin with daily application is a poison. It accumulates in tissue. It attacks the nervous system. It causes abdominal pain, muscle weakness, memory loss, and over time a progressive deterioration that can end in organ failure. It also caused, with devastating irony, exactly the skin damage it was meant to conceal: inflammation, darkening of the complexion breakouts that left fresh blemishes, requiring fresh layers of paint, creating a cycle from which many wearers never escaped. The historian who first described this as the beauty industry's earliest documented trap was not being dramatic. The cerusse covered the damage it caused, which caused more damage, which required more cerusse. And people knew. That is the part that is hardest to sit with looking back. They genuinely knew the lead was harmful. A 1760 beauty manual called The Art of Beauty warned readers against using cinnabar as a component of rouge, on the grounds that it would cause tooth loss, foul breath, and excessive salivation. The author correctly identified the symptoms of mercury poisoning, and then in the very same paragraph recommended a white face paint containing lead. Both women and men continued using these products for decades after the warnings were widely circulated. Knowing something is dangerous and continuing to use it anyway, because the social cost of looking wrong in the room is more immediate than the health cost of looking right. That is not an 18th century problem. That is a human problem, and I think we recognize it more than we might like to admit. Now let me tell you about Maria Gunning. She was by all accounts among the most celebrated beauties in mid-18th century England, an Irish-born noblewoman who became the Countess of Coventry, and who in the social world of 1750s London drew the kind of attention we would now associate with a film star. Men reportedly stopped in the street to watch her pass. She was painted multiple times, including a portrait by the Swiss artist Jean-Etienne Lyotard that still captures something of the quality that made her so noticed, a particular brightness, a luminous complexion. That luminous complexion was maintained in part with ceruse. Maria applied it liberally daily for years, and the lead did what lead does, it damaged her skin. She added more ceruse to cover the damage. The cycle continued. When she died in September of 1760, she was 27 years old. Her husband, the Earl of Coventry, had apparently been so concerned about her makeup habits that he had once tried to wipe the ceruse from her face himself, in public, an act she reportedly found deeply humiliating. In the weeks before her death, according to period accounts, she retreated to a darkened bedroom and refused to see visitors. Whether from genuine illness or from the acute awareness of how she now looked without the paint she could no longer wear, we cannot say with certainty. A 7-foot gilded mirror from her dressing room sold at auction in 2012 for more than £300,000. She had ordered it the year before she died. Maria Gunning is often cited as the first recorded victim of cosmetic lead poisoning. She was certainly not the last. The courtesan Kitty Fisher, famous, celebrated, immortalized in a nursery rhyme, died in her 20s, under very similar circumstances, reportedly also from the accumulated effects of lead-based cosmetics. And the question of how many quieter deaths, unremarked and unrecorded in the households of less famous women and men, were caused by the same daily ritual we simply cannot answer. Because yes, men. This is perhaps the part of the story that most surprises people. We have inherited from the Victorian era the firm idea that cosmetics belong to one gender and practicality to the other, but in the early and mid-18th century that line had not yet been drawn. Aristocratic men, bourgeois men, professional men from Paris to London to Philadelphia, all painted their faces in the same white lead foundation, the same vivid rouge on the cheeks, and the same carefully shaped lips. The fashion for male cosmetics in France was particularly pronounced. At the French court, the standard look for a formally dressed man involved a white base applied to the entire face. A generous swath of rouge swept across the cheeks from just below the eye, down to the corner of the mouth, and lips touched with carmine, either painted on with a small brush, or applied by pressing a pad of colour-saturated wool called Spanish wool against the lips until the stain held. Eyebrows were darkened with coal or lamp black, and sometimes plucked thin and repainted in a high arch. By the 1760s, the fashion among the most extreme male followers of cosmetic style was even more dramatic. One contemporary observer writing for the Town & Country magazine described a particular type of fashionable young man seen in London. At the time, we'll talk more about these macaronis in a later part of our story, and noted with evident bewilderment that it was, quote, a puzzle to determine the thing's sex. The white face, the heavily rouged cheeks, the carefully tended brows by the height of the fashion, certain men were wearing cosmetics that made them visually indistinguishable from the women standing beside them. I want to offer a personal observation here because I think it matters. We tend, when we look back at this, to find it amusing or strange. But what strikes me is how completely it dismantles the idea that any standard of masculine appearance is natural or inevitable. These men were not confused about who they were. They were judges, generals, statesmen, intellectuals, and they chose to present themselves this way because it was the visual language of power in their time and place. The idea that masculinity requires plainness, requires an absence of cosmetics, requires a specific kind of deliberate, unadorned presentation, That is not a fact of nature, it is a cultural agreement. And like all cultural agreements, it was made at a specific moment in history by specific people for specific reasons, which means it can be unmade just as deliberately. And then there were the patches. The beauty patch, or in French, the mouche, meaning fly, a name that referred to the dark speck's resemblance to an insect resting on pale skin, was perhaps the most codified, most deliberately communicative element of the entire 18th century face. Made from black silk velvet taffeta or satin gummed on one side and cut into shapes, circles, stars, crescents, hearts, small animals, they were pressed onto the skin at specific locations that had specific, widely understood meanings. And I do mean widely understood. This was not private symbolism. This was a public language that anyone moving in polite society was expected to be able to read at a glance. A patch placed by the corner of the eye signalled passion. One on the forehead was called the assassin. On the cheek it was the gallant. Above the lip was an invitation for a kiss. A patch placed specifically to cover a blemish was called the thief la voleuse, because it was stealing the viewer's eye away from an imperfection. Women who were engaged wore heart-shaped patches on their left cheek. Married women transferred them to the right. In England, by the early 1700s, the patches had gone explicitly political. Supporters of the Whig Party wore their patches on the right side of the face. Supporters of the Tories wore theirs on the left. A woman could walk into a room and declare her political allegiance before she opened her mouth simply by which cheek she had chosen to decorate. The journalist and writer Richard Steele, writing in The Spectator in 1711, noted the case of a lady who had placed her patch on the wrong cheek to cover an inconvenient pimple, causing people in the room to misjudge her politics entirely. The patch Steele observed had become so loaded with meaning that even its placement for purely practical reasons could constitute an involuntary political declaration. Think about that for a moment. A small piece of velvet stuck to a woman's face was carrying information about disease desire, marital status, and party affiliation simultaneously. A single square inch of black silk was doing the communicative work that we now spread across Instagram profiles, LinkedIn bios, and political lawn signs. But here is the part of the patch story that I find most quietly devastating, and it brings us back to the same dark thread that runs through this whole era. The patches were not always purely decorative, not even mostly. Smallpox, which affected an estimated 1/4 of the European population at various points in this century, left survivors with deep-pitted facial scarring that no amount of cerus could fully conceal. The patches covered what the paint could not reach, and the other diseases, the ones we discussed in an earlier part of our story, treated with mercury, that caused its own facial damage, left marks of their own. Henri Misson, a French traveller writing about England in 1719, noted with considerable astonishment that he had counted 15 patches or more on the face of a single elderly woman. He found it absurd. He was probably not entirely wrong. But he was looking at the surface. What he was actually seeing was the accumulated geography of a life. The pockmarks, the scars, the damaged skin, the blemishes that the social world required to be hidden, each one covered by a small, precise piece of black silk, so that the face could remain, at least in the candlelit room, what it was supposed to be: smooth, pale, impenetrable, perfect. There is something I cannot quite shake when I think about it. An entire civilization covering its wounds with velvet stars and calling them beauty marks. Not as deception exactly, but as translation, turning the evidence of suffering into something that could be read socially as elegance. By 1781, French women alone were using approximately 2 million pots of rouge per year. 2 million. In a country where bread would soon be scarce enough to start a revolution. The face was everything. The face had to be maintained, and the tools for maintaining it, The lead, the cinnabar, the mercury, the ceruse steeping in horse manure for 3 weeks, were quietly doing what they always do when beauty and safety are placed in direct competition with each other. They were winning. There is something we have not yet touched on in this whole story of powder and perfume and painted faces, and it is perhaps the most unexpectedly political chapter of all of them. It involves flour, actual edible flour being dusted onto the heads of the nobility while people in the streets of Paris are rioting over the price of bread. And it ends with a taxa revolution and a man named William Pitt the Younger deciding that enough was enough. That moment, the moment when fashion collided with fury, is where we are headed next. There is a song you almost certainly know. You probably learned it as a child. You have heard it at parades, at fireworks shows, at 4th of July celebrations, where the afternoon smells like sunscreen and barbecue. You can probably hum it right now without even trying. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. It is one of the most recognizable melodies in the entire American songbook, and almost nobody who sings it today knows what it actually means. That feather, that cap, that macaroni. This is where we are tonight, and I promise you the story behind those 4 lines is going to change the way you hear that song for the rest of your life. To understand the macaronis, you need to understand what Europe looked like to a wealthy young Englishman in the mid-1700s. By the 1760s, the 7 Years' War had finally ended, and the roads across the continent were open again to travellers. And a tradition had developed among the English aristocracy, a kind of mandatory cultural pilgrimage for young men of means that was known simply as the Grand Tour. You travelled to France, you travelled to Italy, you spent time in Rome, in Florence, in Venice, absorbing art and architecture and opera and food and fashion, and you came home in theory a better, broader, more cultivated version of yourself. In practice, many of these young men came home with something slightly different, an overwhelming conviction that everything in England was provincial, and a wardrobe that made absolutely everyone around them deeply uncomfortable. These were the macaronis. The writer Horace Walpole, one of the sharpest social observers of the entire 18th century, mentioned them in a letter written in 1764, describing what he called the Macaroni Club at Almack's in London, as being composed of, in his words, all the travelled young men who wear long curls and spying glasses. He said it with a particular aristocratic dryness that suggests both amusement and mild alarm, which is probably the appropriate response. The name itself came from the pasta. On the Grand Tour, these young men had encountered macaroni, a dish then almost entirely unknown in England, genuinely exotic, associated with the sophistication and continental elegance they were so aggressively pursuing. They loved it. They adopted it as a kind of emblem. And they began using the word as their highest term of approval. Anything fashionable, anything elevated, anything that marked you as having left England behind and understood something greater was called, in their private vocabulary, very macaroni. The Oxford Magazine in 1770 described one of them with a kind of exhausted incredulity that I find very relatable. There is indeed a kind of animal, neither male nor female, a thing of the neuter gender lately started up among us. It is called a macaroni. It talks without meaning, it smiles without pleasantry, it eats without appetite, it rides without exercise, it wenches without passion. Which is honestly one of the most devastating sentences the 18th century ever produced about a human being. Someone was furious when they wrote that, and you can feel every word of it. So what did a macaroni actually look like? Let me paint you a picture, because the reality was significantly more spectacular than you might imagine. Start with a wig. We have talked about wigs throughout this story, the standard powdered periwig of the mid-18th century, which was elaborate enough by any measure. The macaroni took that wig and added about 18 inches to the top of it, towering teased powdered constructions that sometimes approached half the height of the man wearing them. dressed with elaborate curls on each side, and a small, frankly ridiculous tiny hat called a nivernois, named after the French ambassador to London, perched on the very apex, far too small to actually wear, serving no functional purpose whatsoever, which was rather the point. Then the coat narrow tight, fitted in a way that was considered shockingly form-revealing by English standards of the time, cut from silk or velvet in vivid colours, pale blue, rose-pink acid yellow with heavy embroidery, large decorative buttons and an excess of lace at the cuffs and collar. The breeches were equally tight. The shoes had towering heels, red heels in the French court tradition, were particularly fashionable, and enormous decorative buckles. A large nosegay of fresh flowers was pinned to the chest. Multiple watch fobs hung from the waistcoat. A monocle, sometimes called a quizzing glass, was carried for observing the world through a lens of detached, affected appraisal. Beauty patches on the face, of course. Rouge. The whole face. The historian William Hickey recorded with genuine amazement watching a friend of his return from 6 months in France as a completely transformed person. He described seeing this man, whom he'd last seen in a plain brown cloth suit with unpowdered hair, reappear wearing, in his words, a furiously powdered and pomatumed head, with 6 curls on each side, a little skimming dish of a hat, and an attitude of such calm, continental superiority that Hickey barely recognised him. Now I want you to hold this image in your mind: an 18-inch wig, a tiny useless hat, a face full of rouge and patches, a coat the colour of a spring garden, shoes with red heels. And I want to ask you something, honestly. How does that make you feel looking at it? Because I noticed that most people, when they encounter the macaronis for the first time, feel one of two things. Either a kind of delighted fascination, look at these magnificent, ridiculous, totally committed men, or a kind of reflexive discomfort, a sense that something has gone wrong with masculinity here, that this is not how men are supposed to present themselves. And the second reaction is interesting, because it is not a timeless human reaction. It is an inherited one. It was manufactured quite deliberately in the 1770s and 80s by a very specific combination of political anxiety, cultural nationalism and satirical print media that was extremely good at its job. Understanding how that happened is, I think, the most important part of the whole macaroni story. In the early years of the trend, the mid-1760s, when the fashion was still primarily confined to genuinely wealthy, genuinely well-travelled young aristocrats, the macaronis were regarded with mostly amused contempt. Their clothes were outrageous, but their social credentials were impeccable, and English society, while rolling its eyes, essentially tolerated them. The problem came in the early 1770s when the fashion began to spread. By 1772, the macaroni style had escaped its aristocratic origins entirely. The Universal magazine noted with visible horror that England was now overrun with, in its words, macaroni parsons, turf macaronis, macaroni dancing masters, and what it called Grub Street macaronis, writers and journalists affecting the style. Mary Darley, a professional caricaturist whose London print shop became so dedicated to mocking them that it was known simply as the Macaroni Print Shop, was producing and selling satirical images of bewigged, bepowdered, elaborately costumed men as fast as the engravers could work. Her prints were among the first major uses of caricature as deliberate, sustained social criticism in British history. And simultaneously, two things were happening in the wider world that made the whole situation feel genuinely threatening to people who were already anxious. The first was the growing tension with the American colonies, a conflict that many people in Britain read as evidence that the national spirit was weakening, that luxury and self-indulgence had softened the country's moral and military fibre. The macaronis, with their obsession with French fashion, their rejection of English plainness, their air of cosmopolitan superiority, became an obvious symbol of everything that was supposedly wrong. The London magazine complained that the appearance of a Frenchman, which had formerly set every Englishman laughing, was now entirely adopted in Britain. The macaroni fashion was described as un-English, as unmanly, as a kind of cultural betrayal. The second thing was the 7-year post-war national debt, which had reached over £130 million by 1763. In a country struggling with that kind of financial strain, young men spending fortunes on French silk Italian pasta and 18-inch wigs did not look like sophisticated cosmopolitans. They looked like a problem, and here is where the song comes in. Around 1755, a British army surgeon named Richard Shuckburgh, stationed in New York, while the British and colonial forces were fighting together in what Americans call the French and Indian War, was apparently watching the ragtag colonial militiamen assembling nearby, and was moved to put some lyrics to a tune that was already well known. The resulting song was a straightforward piece of military mockery designed to make British soldiers laugh at their American allies. The central joke of the famous verse stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni was built entirely on the macaroni fashion. The point was this: a Yankee Doodle, meaning a stupid colonial simpleton, thought that he could become sophisticated and fashionable simply by sticking a single feather in his cap. He thought that was enough to be macaroni, enough to be refined, elevated, worldly. The gap between what a proper macaroni actually looked like and what this poor bumpkin thought he was doing was the entire joke. It was not a compliment. It was the 18th century equivalent of someone saying, "Look at this guy, he thinks he's at the Oscars, and he's showing up in sweatpants." The British marched toward Lexington and Concord in 1775 playing it. They played it at the Americans as a taunt, and the Americans, and I love this about them, genuinely decided they did not care, adopted the song, added their own verses to it, and sang it back. By 1781, Yankee Doodle was a song of American victory. The insult had been turned inside out and worn as a badge of honor. The feather and the cap and the macaroni, which were meant to mock American simplicity, became instead symbols of a different kind of identity, one that had no interest in the aristocratic European game of social signalling that measured a man by something other than the height of his wig. It was looked at from the right angle, a quiet revolution in how a country was choosing to define itself. But back in England, the macaroni story was ending rather differently. By the late 1770s, the satire had done its work. The image of the macaroni, the man who was in the Oxford magazine's immortal phrase, "neither male nor female a thing of the neuter gender," had attached itself so firmly to the excess of continental fashion that wearing it was no longer just eccentric, it was a liability. The fashion began to contract. The wigs shrank, the colours moderated, the patches disappeared from men's faces, and something important had shifted in the underlying cultural agreement about what masculinity looked like, not just in England, but slowly across the Western world. The macaronis had pushed the aesthetic of the masculine adornment to its absolute outer limit, and the cultural immune system of English society had responded with every satirical weapon it had and won. In winning, it had drawn a new line, harder, less permeable than before, around what counted as acceptable male appearance. Not because of some timeless natural law, but because a specific political moment had made excess seem dangerous, and a very good caricaturist had done her job extremely well. The irony, and it is a deep one, is that the men being mocked most viciously for wearing makeup and towering wigs were themselves the descendants of a culture that had always worn both. The macaronis were not inventing something new. They were simply pushing further down a road that European gentlemen had been travelling for 100 years. What changed was not the road. What changed was the moment, and moments, as we're about to see, have a way of arriving faster than anyone expects. Because while the macaronis were being caricatured and ridiculed in London, print shops something far more consequential was building across the channel, something that had nothing to do with fashion except that it would end it overnight. The people of France were running out of bread, and the nobility were still putting flour on their wigs. That collision between hunger and powder, between revolution and ritual, is a story of extraordinary force, and it is the story we're entering next. Forget for a moment everything you have ever been told about what a perfume is for. Forget the small glass bottle on the bathroom shelf, the quick spray before you leave the house, the habit you've developed without ever really thinking about why. Forget the advertising, the deserts and the black and white models and the word sensual in a slow voice. Forget all of it, and travel instead to a room at Versailles in 1682. You're standing in one of the gilded salons of the most talked-about building in the world, surrounded by hundreds of courtiers in silk and powder and velvet. Candles are burning in enormous chandeliers overhead. Bowls of fresh flower petals have been placed on every surface. The furniture has been sprayed with scented water. The fountains in the garden outside are running not with plain water, but with perfumed water. And the air in this room is so thick, so layered, so saturated with fragrance that a French historian of the period coined a name for it. La cour parfumée, the perfumed court. This is where the story of perfumers' power begins, not in a pharmacy, not in a flower market, not in a romantic novel, in a palace, in a political calculation, in a king's obsession with controlling every single sensory experience his courtiers would have in his presence, down to what the air itself smelled like. Louis XIV, the same man we met at the beginning of this story, the Sun King with the 48 wig makers, and the lever ceremony and the four-finger wig rule, had alongside all of his other consuming passions for architecture and ceremony and fashion, an extraordinary relationship with scent. He was given the nickname Le Doux Fleurant by those around him, the sweetly scented one, not as a joke, as an accurate description. He was by contemporary accounts terrified of bathing. The widespread belief of the era was that water opened the pores of the skin and made the body vulnerable to disease, a belief that strikes us now as deeply backwards, but was at the time supported by the medical consensus of the day, and would remain influential well into the 18th century. Instead of washing in the conventional sense, Louis cleaned himself with alcohol. Rubs changed his linen shirts multiple times a day. Each shirt perfumed before it touched his skin with a preparation called aqua angeli, a fragrant blend of aloes wood, nutmeg, storax, cloves and benzoin boiled in rosewater, and deployed perfume with a thoroughness that went far beyond personal hygiene. He demanded that his personal perfumer create a different scent for each day of the week. Not each week, each day. 7 distinct fragrances on a rotating schedule, because the Sun King did not repeat himself, not even in the air around his body. He commissioned a private pavilion in blue and white at Versailles, a small intimate structure where he could spend time with his companions, and had it planted and perfumed with stocks, tuberose and white jasmine, so that every breath taken inside it carried something particular and intended. He built the orangery to house the orange trees he loved, partly for the fruit, partly because toward the end of his life, when he had grown so sensitive to strong scents that almost any perfume gave him migraines, the soft, precise smell of orange blossom from trees he had grown himself was the one fragrance he could still bear. There is something I find unexpectedly touching about that detail. The most powerful monarch in the Western world, in his old age, retreating to the gentlest, softest scent he could find, the trees he had planted himself outside a window he could open. But the perfume at Versailles was never merely personal. That is the thing I want you to understand, because it is the thing that transforms it from an interesting historical curiosity into something genuinely fascinating. At the court of Louis XIV, every layer of sensory experience was a social code. We have already talked about the visual language, the wig, the rouge, the patches, but there was an olfactory language running alongside it, equally precise, equally legible to those who knew how to read it. Perfume was expensive, genuinely astronomically expensive, because the raw materials ambergris which came from the bodies of sperm whales, musk extracted from the glands of musk deer in Central Asia, civet from the scent glands of civet cats in Africa, attar of rose requiring hundreds of thousands of petals to produce a single ounce, were some of the most costly substances in the known world. When a courtier walked into a room wearing a fragrance made from these materials, every other person in that room understood immediately that they were in the presence of someone who could afford something extraordinary. But beyond the cost was the individuality. Courtiers of the highest rank at Versailles did not wear perfumes off a shelf. They commissioned them. The Duchesse d'Aumont had her personal fragrance, a blend of coriander, iris, cloves, sweet flag and nut grass, created specifically for her, so recognized by the court that it was called à la Maréchale, after her husband's military title. When she entered a room, people smelled her before they saw her. They knew who was coming. The fragrance announced her rank and her identity simultaneously, the way a coat of arms might announce a nobleman's house. Madame de Montespan, Louis's mistress for many years, apparently bathed in water scented with vanilla, a luxury of remarkable extravagance at a time when vanilla was an exotic import traded at enormous cost. Whether she chose it for the scent itself or for the statement it made, or both, we cannot say with certainty. What we do know is that her relationship with the king's nose was not entirely harmonious. Contemporary accounts record that at one point Louis simply could not tolerate her perfume, that they were heard arguing as they entered the royal carriage, together, the king recoiling from whatever fragrance she had chosen that day. And it is said, though, with that slight edge of gossip that makes historical anecdotes both irresistible and slightly unreliable, that she wore heavy doses of perfume partly because she found the king's own smell unpleasant and was masking it with something stronger. Even the intimacies of Versailles smelled of politics. Now, can I ask you something? Have you ever noticed that when you walk into someone's home for the first time, the smell of it tells you something immediate and specific about the people who live there? Something you cannot quite put into words, but that lands before you have processed a single visual detail. There is a reason perfumers talk about scent as the sense most directly linked to memory and to social recognition. It bypasses the analytical part of the brain almost entirely. You smell something and you feel something before you've had a chance to think about why. Louis XIV understood this in his bones, and he weaponized it with the same strategic precision he brought to everything else. The perfume court was not a court that happened to smell nice. It was a court where the management of scent was a form of political control, where the perfumed fountains and the flower petal bowls and the sprayed furniture all created an olfactory environment that was entirely designed, entirely curated, as much a part of the king's image as the Hall of Mirrors or the ceremonial wig. Visitors who entered Versailles and were doused with perfume upon arrival were not being welcomed. They were being absorbed into a sensory world that someone else had constructed and controlled. They were being told through their noses, before any word had been spoken, that they were in a particular kind of place, subject to a particular kind of power. A well-bred man, wrote the French writer Jean-François Regnard, must be exquisitely perfumed. It is this, he said, which distinguishes him from other men. Not his title, not his education, not his land. His perfume. By the time of Louis XV and the mid-18th century, the olfactory culture of the court had shifted in interesting ways. The heavy animalic, almost architectural perfumes of Louis XIV's era, the dark musks and civets and ambergris that clung to curtains and lingered in rooms for days, had given way to something lighter, more volatile, more conversational. Floral scents became dominant: rose jasmine, tuberose violet, eau de cologne, a preparation of citrus neroli, bergamot, lavender, rosemary and grape spirit that had been developed in the city of Cologne in Germany around 1709 arrived at Versailles in the 1760s, brought back by French soldiers returning from the 7 Years' War and spread through the court like a particularly pleasant rumour. Perfume was no longer just about masking odour or asserting rank. By the middle of the 18th century it had taken on an explicitly seductive dimension that earlier eras had not quite acknowledged in the same way. Where earlier perfume at court had been about authority, about the visible demonstration of wealth, in an invisible medium the new lighter scents were about something more personal, more intimate, more specifically about the encounter between one person and another. Madame de Pompadour, the official chief mistress of Louis XV, and arguably the most influential woman in France for nearly 20 years, was famously prodigious in her use of perfume. After her departure from the rooms she'd occupied at Versailles, the distinctive scent of musk was reportedly still detectable in the curtains 20 years later. 20 years. She had not been there for 20 years and her smell remained. I am not sure there is a better metaphor for a certain kind of power than that. And then came the revolution, which was among many other things also a revolution in smell. The powdered wig fell. The white lead paint was abandoned. The elaborate morning ritual of the powder room and the rouge and the beauty patches became almost overnight the visual language of the enemy of the aristocracy that the revolutionary movement had defined itself against. A man who wanted to demonstrate his solidarity with the new France did not powder his hair. He wore it plain cut, short, unpowdered, natural, and perfumers who had built their trade on the patronage of exactly the people now losing their heads to the guillotine, found themselves in a very delicate position. Some of them closed, some reinvented themselves as suppliers of simpler, more democratic scents for the new middle-class consumer who was beginning to emerge, and one or two found to their considerable relief a new champion entirely. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not of royal blood. He had not been raised to court ceremony. He came from Corsica, where the hillsides were covered with rosemary and thyme and lavender, and the smell of those herbs was apparently woven so deeply into his earliest memories that it moved with him everywhere he went for the rest of his life. Napoleon's relationship with eau de cologne was, to put it plainly, extraordinary. He had a standing order with his perfumer, a man named Gervais Chardin, to deliver 50 bottles every month. The French National Archives contain an invoice from October of 1808 showing that 72 bottles were ordered that month. He used 2 to 3 bottles a day, pouring it liberally over his shoulders and neck after bathing, rubbing it into his skin with a brush, and according to several reliable contemporary accounts, occasionally drinking small amounts of it, believing firmly that it had genuine medicinal properties. He once said without apparent irony that eau de cologne was a protection against many diseases. He had the perfumer Jean-Marie Farina design him a specially shaped bottle, long, very thin and tapered, that could slide easily into his boot, so that he would always have it with him in the field. A professor at De Montfort University in England published a research paper in 2021 arguing that Napoleon's extraordinary consumption of eau de cologne, maintained for decades, may actually have contributed to his death, that the essential oils absorbed through the skin in such quantities over so many years could have acted as endocrine disruptors and contributed to the gastric cancer found during his autopsy. Napoleon, who had managed to survive some of the most brutal military campaigns in European history, may have been gradually undone by his own cologne. There is something almost Shakespearean about that. The thing that comforted him most, that connected him most viscerally to his childhood and to his sense of himself, the thing he could not live without and carried into exile, and begged his servant to recreate when his supply ran out on St. Helena, that according to at least one scientist is what killed him. What I keep coming back to sitting with all of this is what perfume actually does in the hands of people who understand it. It is invisible. It cannot be seen or touched. It leaves no written record, keeps no archive. Historians have to work from invoices and diaries and the occasional lucky survival of an original recipe. The scent of Versailles under Louis XIV, the orange blossom and the tuberose and the aqua angeli on the king's shirts is gone. The musk in Madame de Pompadour's curtains is gone. The eau de cologne Napoleon poured over himself on the morning of Waterloo is gone. And yet, the decisions made in the rooms those scents inhabited are still with us. The treaties signed, the wars begun, the alliances forged, and broken the cultural standards set and abandoned. All of it happened in rooms that smelled a certain way by men who understood that how they presented themselves to the world in every dimension, including the invisible ones, was not a trivial matter. There is a lesson in that, I think, about the difference between what leaves a record and what leaves a mark. We've been following the story of powder and perfume and pride through courts and powder rooms and grand tours and revolutions, and there is one thread we have not fully pulled, yet the thread that runs from the court of Versailles all the way to the American founders, and answers a question that might have been sitting in the back of your mind since part 1. We know that George Washington never wore a wig. We know that Thomas Jefferson eventually gave his up. We know that the powdered look was fading by the 1790s. But the how of it, the specific political moment, the tax, the flour shortages, the way an entire visual world disappeared in what felt like practically an instant, that story is still waiting. And it is a story with the villain who is also, depending on your point of view, the hero. His name is William Pitt the Younger. He was 26 years old when he became Prime Minister of Britain. And in 1795 he did something that ended an era of fashion in a single parliamentary session. We are going there now. Something was building in France in the 1780s that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with bread. Actually, let me say that differently. Because the connection between fashion and bread in that particular decade was not metaphorical. It was direct physical and deeply viscerally understood by the people living through it. The connection was flour. The same flour that the nobility were raking through their wigs every morning. To understand what happened next, you need to feel the weight of what ordinary life in France looked like in the years immediately before the Revolution. Not the court life, not the salons and the perfumed fountains and the patch boxes and the powder rooms. The other France. The France where bread was not a backdrop, it was the entire story. By the 1780s, historians estimate that an ordinary French wage labourer was spending somewhere between half and 80% of his daily earnings on bread alone. Not food bread specifically, because bread was the diet. A poor family in Paris might eat 2 or 3 pounds of bread per person per day, and almost nothing else. When harvests were good, this was survivable. When they were not, it was not. And the harvests were not good. In 1788 and 1789, 2 consecutive years of poor grain harvests pushed bread prices to a point that the economic historian Sylvia Neely described as reaching 88% of a worker's daily wages. Not 40%, not 60%, 88% on bread. The arithmetic of that is staggering. A man works all day, and when he brings home his wages he can afford bread. He cannot afford his rent. He cannot afford firewood. He cannot afford anything other than the bread that will keep his family alive until he goes to work again tomorrow. And at Versailles the court was still powdering its wigs. A high society wig required approximately 1 pound of flour-based starch per dressing. 1 pound. Every morning. For hundreds of courtiers across thousands of mornings stretching back decades. I want you to hold those 2 images side by side for a moment, because the people of France were holding them side by side every single day. The bread they could not afford. The flour on the wig. It did not require a pamphlet or a political education to understand the injustice. It was written in the most visceral language possible, the language of hunger. There had been warnings, years of them. In April and May of 1775, 14 years before the main revolution, a wave of riots had swept across France in what became known as the Flour War. It started in Beaumont-sur-Oise when the price of bread rose sharply after grain price controls were abolished, and within days it had spread to over 300 locations across central France. Rioters stormed grain markets, they seized flour shipments, they offered sellers what they considered the just price the food was worth to human beings who needed it to survive, and took it by force when it was refused. Some of the rioters marched on Versailles itself. Think about that moment, a crowd of hungry people marching toward the most perfumed, most elaborately costumed court in the history of Europe, carrying grievances written in the language of starvation. The governor of Dijon, watching this crowd from his comfortable vantage point, reportedly told them the grass had sprouted and they could go to the fields and eat it. He said that to human beings who were asking for bread. The riots were suppressed eventually by 25,000 soldiers, with arrests with hangings. 2 rioters were executed as examples in the Place de Grève, a 28-year-old wig maker and his 16-year-old companion chosen deliberately to send a message. The irony of executing a wig maker over bread riots in a country where wig powder consumed the grain supply apparently went unnoticed by the authorities. History sometimes chooses its symbols carefully. By 1789, the situation had moved far beyond food prices. Between 1760 and 1789, French historians have counted 652 separate food-related revolts. 652 moments where ordinary people pushed past endurance, took to the streets over the most fundamental human need there is. The storming of the Bastille in July of 1789 began among other things as a search for grain. And in October of that year, several thousand women, the women of Paris who bore the daily reality of feeding their families on impossible wages, marched to Versailles. All the way to Versailles, in the rain. They marched 12 miles and they brought the royal family back to Paris with them, singing as they walked that now they had the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's son, and now they would have bread. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who had grown up in a world where the fountains ran with scented water and a different perfume filled the rooms each day of the week, never really grasped what they had become in the eyes of the people they governed. The wig was not just a wig by 1789. The flower in the wig was not just fashion. It was a symbol so powerful, so legible, so absolutely clear in its meaning, that when the revolution did what revolutions do, one of the first things the revolutionary movement declared was this: we do not wear wigs anymore. Cutting off your powder, tying your hair short and plain, stepping out without the elaborate construction of the Ancien Régime on your head, these were not just personal choices. They were political declarations. They were a way of saying in the most visible language available, I am not one of them. Wigs became almost overnight a symbol of everything the revolution was against. Men who continued to wear them in Paris in the early 1790s were taking a social risk that had nothing to do with fashion, and everything to do with which side you were perceived to be on. The guillotine was not subtle in its messaging, and the people losing their heads to it were quite literally the people who had spent the most on their hair. Now let me ask you something that genuinely puzzles me every time I think about it. How does a fashion that had dominated European masculine culture for over 100 years, that had survived disease, political upheaval, the mocking of the macaronis, the spread of Enlightenment values, the American Revolution, and decades of changing tastes, how does something like that end? What is the mechanism? What is the specific moment when something that was simply how things were suddenly becomes how things were? In France, the answer was obvious. Revolution has a way of clarifying cultural questions very quickly. But in England, in Britain, where there was no revolution, where the government remained stable, where powdered hair had been a standard element of respectable male appearance, since the reign of Charles II, the ending was different. More gradual, more politically complicated, and ultimately catalyzed by a single piece of legislation from a man who was at the time 26 years old. William Pitt the Younger became Prime Minister of Britain in 1783. He was, as I mentioned, 26. The youngest Prime Minister in British history, inheriting a country with enormous debt from the American War and about to face the extraordinary expense of the Napoleonic Wars with France. Pitt needed money, significant amounts of money, and he had a gift for identifying things people valued enough to pay to keep and taxing them. He had already introduced a stamp duty on hair powder in 1786, which required sellers to pay a small tax on every packet sold. The fashion continued largely unaffected, but in 1795, facing the escalating costs of a continental war and a country that had watched France consume itself in revolution and was deeply unsettled by the example, Pitt introduced the Duty on Hair Powder Act. It was elegant in its simplicity. If you wish to use hair powder, any hair powder on a wig or on your own hair, you are required to go to a stamp office, register your name and pay 1 guinea per year for a certificate confirming your right to do so. 1 guinea. In purchasing power today, that is roughly equivalent to somewhere between £100 and £150, a significant sum for a single annual luxury licence. The exemptions were carefully constructed. The royal family and their servants did not pay. Clergymen earning below £100 a year were exempt. Various ranks of the military were exempt. And a father with more than 2 unmarried daughters at home could purchase a single certificate that covered all of them, a provision that is somehow both practical and faintly comic, suggesting that Pitt had thought carefully about which households needed the most powder and tried to give them a discount. The people who did not receive exemptions, the professional classes, the gentry, the merchants, the lawyers, the doctors, the fashionable middle tier of British society that had been powdering its hair for generations, had a choice: pay the guinea and keep the powder, or stop. Almost all of them stopped. The tax raised £200,000 in its first year, which sounds significant until you realise that Pitt had expected considerably more, because what happened was not what he had predicted. He had assumed that fashion-conscious people would pay rather than abandon the look. What he had not fully reckoned with was that the fashion was already weakening, that the revolutionary sentiment from France had already begun seeping into British consciousness, that the idea of natural hair as a mark of serious, modern, unpretentious masculinity had already taken root, and that his tax did not actually prevent people from powdering their hair so much as it gave them the perfect excuse to stop doing something they'd been quietly ready to give up anyway. The political cartoonist James Gilray, the sharpest satirical eye in 18th century Britain, produced a print in 1795 that captured the moment with devastating precision. It showed a family gathered around a table examining the guinea they would have to spend on the powder certificate, each member counting the cost. The print was titled "Leaving Off Powder or a Frugal Family Saving the Guinea." It was enormously popular. It was shared, discussed, quoted, because it said out loud what thousands of households were already feeling, that paying for the right to put flour on your hair was at this particular moment in history an embarrassing thing to do. The men who chose to keep paying, and some did, mostly the older conservative gentry, who had worn powder their entire adult lives and were not about to let a tax change that were mockingly called guinea pigs by the press. The phrase had a double edge. It referenced the guinea they had paid, and it referenced the pigtail hairstyle that was still fashionable among the powder wearers. Guinea pigs. It landed with exactly the gentle public ridicule that signals the end of a fashion. And the men who refused often, with an interesting irony, members of the reformist Whig party, who opposed both Pitt's government and the war with France, cut their hair short. The short-cropped natural hairstyle that French revolutionaries had adopted as their visual rejection of the Ancien regime now became in Britain a political statement about opposition to Pitt and solidarity with a different vision of what men should look like. Crop clubs formed across the country informal groups of men who'd cut their hair short in protest and solidarity. The Times newspaper reported on one such club in Lambeth in April of 1795, noting that every member upon joining was required to have his head cut as close as possible. There is a detail I find genuinely poignant about all of this, and I want to share it because I think it illuminates something true about how change actually happens. The tax on hair powder was never repealed in the 19th century. It stayed on the books, technically in force for decades after the fashion had completely vanished. By the mid-19th century, fewer than 1,000 people per year in the entirety of Britain were still paying it. 1,000 people in a country of millions still going to the stamp office to renew their annual certificate for the right to use flour on their hair. Who were they older judges, perhaps attached to the visual identity of their profession? Elderly gentlemen in country houses who had worn powder since youth and saw no reason to change. Ceremonial holdouts for whom the ritual meant something that was harder to name than fashion. The tax was finally repealed in 1861, by which point, of course, the world it had been designed to govern had been gone for 60 years. The ending of the powdered wig era was not, when you look at it honestly, a single dramatic moment. It was a convergence. The flower that went on aristocratic heads in France became, in the imagination of a starving population, an unbearable symbol of something rotten in the way power had been distributed for 100 years. The revolution translated that resentment into political and cultural transformation. The guillotine made the wig the headwear of people you did not want to be associated with. And across the Channel, a 26-year-old Prime Minister raised a war tax that happened to fall on an already weakening fashion and accidentally lit the final fuse. Within the span of a single decade, roughly 1789 to 1799, the visual world of the 18th century gentleman had effectively ended. The powder went, the wigs followed. The rouge and the patches retreated almost entirely from male faces, and in the space that opened up, something new arrived, something plainer, darker, more sober, and in its own way just as deliberate as everything that had come before. It would eventually have a name, the great masculine renunciation. The moment when Western men collectively, almost simultaneously, decided that the visual language of seriousness required the absence of adornment rather than its presence. That is a story for later in our evening. But first, because this question has been sitting in the background since we talked about the lever ceremony at the very beginning of tonight, there is still the matter of the American founders, of the men who wore the language of powder in a world where it was already beginning to feel complicated, of the president who refused the wig, of the one who kept his right up until someone told him to stop, and of what that particular debate about hair tells us about how a new nation decided to present itself to the world. That story is coming right now. The hair on the dollar bill is not a wig. Let that land for a moment. Because I can almost guarantee that if you were asked right now, even with everything we have discussed tonight, the image that comes to mind when you picture George Washington is still that familiar one. The swept-back white hair, the slight curl above each ear, the composed and slightly stern expression, the general impression that this is a man in a very expensive hairpiece looking directly at posterity. But it was not a wig, not a single strand of it. It was his own hair, naturally reddish-brown, powdered white, for the same reason every gentleman of his era powdered his hair, because white hair was the visual language of status and dignity, and George Washington was, if nothing else, a man who understood exactly how the visual language of status worked, Ron Chernow's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Washington notes this with the same kind of quiet astonishment that anyone feels the first time they encounter it. George Washington, the man whose image is more reproduced than almost any other in American history, the man on the dollar bill and the quarter, and the countless paintings in every courthouse and schoolroom across the country, never wore a wig. Not once in his adult life. He was by contemporary accounts quietly proud of this fact. He had, in a century when baldness was socially catastrophic and elaborate hairpieces were the default solution, a full and complete head of naturally healthy hair. He kept it. Long. Pulled it into a military queue, the tight ponytail at the back that was the practical no-nonsense hairstyle of soldiers, and working men fluffed it on the sides to create the fashionable lateral wings that made the look recognizable, and then powdered the entire construction white. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, which was remarkable for his era. He was powerfully built, and on top of all of it sat this magnificent, fully natural, thoroughly powdered head of hair that mimicked the look of a wig without ever being one. He was playing the game of appearances with the same calculation he brought to everything else, choosing the form of the fashion while quietly maintaining the substance of authenticity. There is something very Washington about that. But here is the part of the American story that I find genuinely fascinating and that most people have never thought about in quite this way. The founding generation of the United States, the men who debated and wrote and signed the documents that created a new country, had to make a decision about wigs that nobody in Europe had to make because nobody in Europe was starting from scratch. In France, the revolution resolved the question violently. The wig was the symbol of everything the revolution hated, and it disappeared with the same speed that heads were disappearing from necks. In Britain, the decision was gradual, reluctant driven partly by a war tax and partly by fashion drift. But in the United States, in the decade between 1780 and 1790, a group of men were consciously constructing a new visual identity for a new kind of government. And the question of whether that government's leaders should look like European aristocrats, powdered, wigged, formally decorated in the established manner was genuinely contested. And the contest was not abstract. It was fought in the actual rooms where the new republic was being built, person by person, outfit by outfit, with all the stakes of identity formation that any of us feel when we're trying to decide who we want to be seen as. Alexander Hamilton was by most contemporary accounts spectacularly well dressed. He cared about clothes with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had grown up with nothing and understood intuitively what the right clothes could do for a person in a room full of people who had never known anything but privilege. Hamilton favoured the full formal European look, elegant, precise, elaborately turned out. He argued that American judges should wear robes and wigs just as their English counterparts did, because the authority of the law required a visual dignity that plain clothing could not provide. Thomas Jefferson, who differed with Hamilton on so many issues that their disagreements became one of the defining intellectual tensions of the early republic, disagreed about this too. Jefferson's approach to his own appearance was famously sometimes deliberately informal. He received visitors at the White House in a bathrobe. He answered the door at Monticello in clothes that foreign diplomats found startlingly casual. He described himself as opposed to what he called needless official apparel, and he thought the entire tradition of judicial wigs was not just outdated but actively absurd. His exact words about the wig, recorded and repeated by contemporaries, were these: "For heaven's sake, discard the monstrous wig which makes the English judges look like rats peeping through bunches of oakum." Rats peeping through bunches of oakum. Oakum being the frayed rope fibre used to seal the gaps in ship hulls. Thomas Jefferson, one of the finest writers in the English language, deploying that specific, slightly horrifying image to describe what he saw when he looked at a powdered wig on a judge. He was not being kind. He was being precisely as unkind as he intended to be. The moment this collision came to a head was on February the 2nd, 1790, the first day the Supreme Court of the United States convened. It was in many ways a remarkable occasion, the beginning of an institution that would define American law for centuries to come. There were questions of enormous consequence that the new court would eventually have to navigate the balance of federal and state power, the meaning of constitutional rights, the relationship between law and politics in a democracy. History would prove that this institution mattered profoundly. But on the actual first day, the most pressing question before the assembled justices was genuinely and without irony, what do we wear to work? Alexander Hamilton had his answer, robes and wigs. Thomas Jefferson had his answer, neither, but if one must choose, at least abandon the rats and the oakum. And then Justice William Cushing of Massachusetts resolved the question by simply showing up, arriving in New York wearing the full white powdered wig he had worn throughout his career on the Massachusetts bench, as though the question had never been under debate at all. What happened next is one of those small historical moments that contains, I think, an enormous amount of human truth inside it. Justice Cushing walked out of the courthouse in his wig and encountered a crowd of boys outside. And the boys, as boys have always done and presumably always will do, laughed at him. Not politically, not ideologically, just laughed the way children laugh at something that looks ridiculous when seen without the frame of social convention that makes it seem normal. And Justice Cushing, a man of considerable legal distinction and dignity, was stung by it. He went back to Jefferson, and Jefferson said what Jefferson always said, for heaven's sake, take the thing off your head. He did. And that was effectively the end of the American judicial wig. Not a law, not a formal decree, not a political manifesto. A group of boys laughing outside a courthouse in 1790, and a justice who found that the laughter hurt in a way that ideological argument had not quite managed. Now, do you know what I find most interesting about that story? It is not the boys, and it is not Jefferson's elegant contempt for the wig. It is Cushing. Justice. William Cushing had worn that wig for years. He'd been appointed to the Massachusetts Superior Court in 1772, and he had worn a wig through the entire Revolutionary period, through the years when powdered hair was being abandoned in the streets of Boston, as a political statement when colonial opposition to British tradition was finding expression in exactly the kind of dress choices Jefferson was advocating. And yet, Cushing kept his wig. This tells me something about the genuinely complicated nature of fashion and identity and professional self-conception. Cushing was not a simple man or a backward one. He was a distinguished jurist who had navigated remarkable historical upheaval. But the wig was part of how he understood himself as a judge. It was part of the visual grammar of authority that he'd been trained in and had performed for nearly 2 decades. Taking it off was not just abandoning a fashion, it was in a real sense renegotiating his own professional identity. And he needed the boys to tip the balance, not Jefferson. That to me is the most honest part of this whole story. Rational argument about the wig's absurdity was not enough. What finally moved Cushing was the simple, uncomplicated social information that the thing looked ridiculous to people who had no investment in pretending otherwise. Among the American presidents, the wig question played out with its own particular set of contradictions. Washington, as we've established, never wore one, but he powdered his natural hair to look as though he did maintaining the visual effect of the fashion, without adopting its most elaborate form. John Adams, who followed Washington as the second president, genuinely did wear wigs throughout much of his career, and his portraits reflect this. The hair in his presidential images has a quality of slight discomfort, an imperfect fit that contemporary observers sometimes noted. Adams complained about his wigs occasionally. They were in his experience precisely as uncomfortable and unreliable as the critics of the form had always suggested. James Madison wore them. James Monroe wore them. Thomas Jefferson, predictably, largely did not, wearing his own naturally reddish hair, in a relatively plain style that some contemporaries found unpresidential, though Jefferson had never much cared what contemporaries found presidential or otherwise. And George Washington, the man who powdered his own hair with such meticulous care that his attendants bundled the ponytail into a silk bag to prevent white powder from streaking across his dark coats. When he danced, he was already, by the standards of the very fashion he was performing, old-fashioned. By the time he became president in 1789, the powdered look was already fading in the circles that set European fashion. He wore it anyway because it was the look he'd adopted and refined over decades, and because he understood perhaps better than anyone that how a president looked was inseparable from what a president meant. What does it mean that we have inherited this image, that for 2+ centuries the most recognizable face of American democratic authority has been a man with what appears to be a formal white hairpiece, but is in fact his own hair, powdered white in the style of a tradition his country had just separated itself from? I think it means something about the genuine complexity of how nations form their identities. You do not get to start entirely from scratch. You carry the visual vocabulary of the world you came from, even as you try to mean something different with it. Washington could not have presented himself to the First Continental Congress in the plain linen shirt and simple dark coat of a working farmer, and expected to be taken seriously as a commander, as a president, as the embodiment of a new republic. The visual language of authority was already established, and authority was what the revolution needed to project. So he worked within the form and bent it. He kept his hair, he powdered it white, he tied it in a military queue rather than a courtly pigtail. He chose American-made broadcloth for his inaugural suit, rather than European silk. He made 1,000 small decisions that, taken together, created a visual identity that looked recognizably like the world it was trying to supersede, but was at every point of actual difference insisting on something new. That is not compromise. That is statecraft. And while all of this was playing out in the drawing rooms and courtrooms and inaugural halls of the new American Republic, something was happening in England that would quietly, and with the slightly anticlimactic quality of all real endings, bring the whole era of powder and wigs to its final close on the other side of the Atlantic. Because Beau Brummel was about to walk into a room, and nothing about how men looked at themselves quite literally would ever be the same again. Somewhere around the turn of the 19th century, a man in London was spending 2 hours every morning on his cravat. Just the cravat. Not the whole getting dressed process that took additional time. Just the folding and tying of the white linen cloth around his neck, a procedure he had reduced to a philosophy, a practice he had elevated with genuine conviction to a form of art. He would go through linen after linen, discarding each failed attempt with a quiet calm that struck visitors as either deeply admirable or faintly insane until the knot fell exactly right. His valet's job during this process was to bring fresh pieces and remove the discarded ones. The pile of rejected cravats on the floor by the time the morning was done could be substantial. His name was George Bryan Brummel, and he was about to do something that 150 years of powdered wigs, painted faces, and elaborate court fashion had not managed to do. He was about to make simplicity the most powerful statement in the room. To understand what Brummel actually did not just to fashion but to the whole idea of what masculine presentation meant, you need to understand where he came from, because the origin story is almost as radical as the revolution itself. He was not an aristocrat. His grandfather had been a shopkeeper. His father had worked as a private secretary to a prime minister, a respectable position, but not a titled one. When Brummel arrived at Eton College as a boy, he was surrounded by the sons of dukes and earls, young men whose families had been defining what English elegance looked like for generations. He watched. He learned. He did the thing that socially ambitious people of genuine intelligence have always done. He identified the game being played, studied it until he understood it better than the people born into it, and then played it better than they did. By the time he was a teenager, he had already begun modifying the school uniform in ways that made his peers look slightly underdressed by comparison. At Oxford, he made cotton stockings and dingy cravats fall out of fashion simply by wearing better ones. When the Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, gave the 16-year-old Brummel a commission in his own regiment in 1794, the connection that would define the next 2 decades of both their lives was formed. The prince was entranced, not just by the clothes but by the whole construction. The wit, the ease, the slightly aristocratic disdain Brummel wore as naturally as other men wore their coats. The prince would spend hours in Brummel's dressing room watching him dress, which was in its own way as remarkable as the lever ceremonies of Versailles. A prince heir to the English throne sitting in the dressing room of a commoner's son watching him tie his cravat, taking notes. Now here is the thing that makes Brummel genuinely revolutionary rather than merely influential. His specific genius was not that he dressed more elaborately than anyone else. It was precisely the opposite. He dressed less elaborately. He simplified. And simplification in a culture that had spent 100 years communicating status through accumulation, more lace, more embroidery, more powder, more height, more colour, more everything, was a radical act. Brummel's daily uniform was dark tailcoat perfectly fitted. Trousers not the knee-length breeches that has been standard for men for over a century, but long trousers cut close, pressed absolutely smooth. A crisp white linen shirt laundered to an almost aggressive cleanliness, and the cravat white starched, knotted with a precision that other men attempted to replicate and largely failed. No powder, no rouge, no beauty patches, no embroidery, no lace beyond the minimal, no elaborate colour. Nothing that announced itself before the man himself entered the room. His rule, the one that has survived him better than almost anything else he said, was this: if people turn to look at you on the street, you are not well dressed. Think about that. After a century in which the entire point of clothing was to make people turn to look at you, in which a full-bottomed periwig and a coat the colour of spring flowers and 3 pounds of wheat starch on your head were considered the appropriate morning costume for a gentleman of standing, Brummel was saying the moment you attract attention you have failed. The goal was not to be seen. The goal was to be perfectly, impeccably, irreproachably correct in a way that was only visible to people who already knew what correct looked like. This was, if you are paying attention, a completely different theory of power from the one the previous century had operated on. Louis XIV's theory of power through appearance was about maximalism, about accumulating so much visual authority that everyone in the room was confronted with it unavoidably before they could even begin to think about who this person was or what they wanted. The powdered wig was a declaration. The full-bottomed periwig was a monument. You saw it and you understood immediately that you were in the presence of someone who had the resources, the servants, the social position, and the leisure to maintain something this impractical. Brummel's theory was something quieter, and in its way more demanding. It was about belonging, about communicating membership in a group so exclusive that you did not need to announce yourself because the people who mattered could already tell. The poorly dressed man turned heads because he was wrong. The Brummel-dressed man turned no heads because he was exactly right, and exactly right in that context simply disappeared into the fabric of appropriate social reality. It was, in short, the birth of understated elegance as the highest form of masculine self-presentation, and it was built on something the previous century had never particularly valued: hygiene. This might be the part that surprises you most. Brummel was fanatical about cleanliness. In an era when the Duke of Norfolk, one of the grandest aristocrats in England, could apparently only be bathed by his servants when he was too drunk to resist a fact that a biographer of the period records without particular horror, suggesting it was not entirely unusual Brummel bathed daily. He cleaned his teeth. He shaved carefully. He wore fresh linen regularly. He insisted that his clothes were immaculately clean and pressed before he put them on. He reportedly once said that he spent 5 hours a day on his personal maintenance, daily. This was not the hour in the powder room dressing a wig. This was 5 hours of bathing, grooming and dressing in the clean, unscented, unembellished style that he had decided was the only acceptable form of masculine presentation. And the extraordinary thing is that it worked. The upper tier of London society followed him. Not because he was born to lead them, but because he was undeniably, infuriatingly right. He had found a new visual language for power, one that the post-revolutionary, post-Flower on Wigs world was ready for, the language of self-mastery, of precision, of controlled, effortless superiority that did not need to shout because it knew that those who mattered could hear it perfectly well at a whisper. But here is where I want to offer a slightly uncomfortable observation. Because Brummel's revolution, for all its genuine elegance, had a consequence that I think we live with every day and rarely examine directly. In 1795, a British psychoanalyst named John Flugel, writing more than a century after the fact in his 1930 book, The Psychology of Clothes, gave a name to what had happened. He called it the Great Masculine Renunciation. His argument was this: at the end of the 18th century, for a combination of reasons, the French Revolution's discrediting of aristocratic excess, the Industrial Revolution's valorization of practical work, and the influence of men like Brummel, who reframe simplicity as superiority, Western men collectively abandoned their claim to be considered beautiful. They, as Flugel put it, henceforth aimed at being only useful. The bright colours went. The elaborate shapes went. The variety went. Dark clothing became the standard. Black, grey, navy, brown, the palette of respectability. The ornate waistcoats and embroidered coats and silk breeches were replaced by the dark tailored suit. The powdered wig, the rouge, the beauty patches, all of it assigned with remarkable speed to women's territory. Fashion in the sense of visible, playful, deliberate self-decoration became within a generation understood as feminine. Seriousness, the seriousness of a man who had important work to do and did not have time for frippery, became masculine. And here is Flugel's key observation, which I think is worth sitting with. This is not how it works in nature. In almost every other species, it is the males who are more ornamental. The peacock, not the peahen. The bird of paradise male with his impossible plumage. In most human cultures outside the Western tradition, at this particular historical moment, men dressed elaborately and colourfully, and saw no contradiction between ornament and strength. The great masculine renunciation, Flugel argued, was a historical accident, a product of specific political and economic conditions, not a natural law. Men had not always dressed this way. They would not necessarily always dress this way. The drab uniformity of the modern suit was not the inevitable expression of masculinity. It was a decision made in a particular moment for particular reasons that got locked in and presented to subsequent generations as timeless. Now let me ask you something genuinely. Does it change anything about how you see the men's suit, the thing so many men put on every morning without a second thought, to know that it was specifically designed in the 1790s and 1800s as a rejection of everything we've been discussing tonight? That the dark jacket and the white shirt and the tie that replaced the cravat were all born in direct opposition to the powdered wig, the rouge, the beauty patch, the orris root perfume. The elaborate ritualized beauty of the world this video has been exploring you are wearing in a very real sense the anti-wig. Brummel himself did not get a quiet, elegant ending. The story that would make you most comfortable, the reformer who transformed fashion and then retired gracefully into a respected old age is not the story that happened. He was underneath all the precision and the wit a gambler and a spendthrift. He had begun his London life with an inheritance of £30,000, and he spent it with the same ease and carelessness that characterised everything else he did. By 1813, his friendship with the Prince Regent had curdled beyond repair. The famous moment at Wattier's club when the Prince publicly cut Brummel by greeting his companions without acknowledging him, and Brummel, humiliated and furious, turned to his friend Lord Alvanley and said with studied calm, "Alvanley, who's your fat friend?" It was a devastating remark. It was also suicidal. The Prince was the most powerful man in the country, and you did not call him your fat friend at a public social event and expect to continue occupying the position Brummel occupied. By 1816, the debts had accumulated past the point where wit and social position could manage them, and Brummel fled to France, first to Calais, then to Caen, to avoid debtor's prison. He spent the last decades of his life in poverty, increasingly unwell, the old influence evaporating, the old friends conspicuously silent. He died in Caen in 1840 from complications of neurosyphilis, the same disease that had helped launch the wig industry. He had done so much to end working its slow final damage in a man who had defined elegance and was dying forgotten in a French asylum. There is something deeply, almost unbearably poignant about that ending. The man who made simplicity fashionable, who replaced the powder with the pristine white shirt, who insisted that true elegance required no announcement, dying in the most undignified way possible, in a foreign country in poverty, remembered by the very city he had dazzled mostly as an anecdote. Fashion is not sentimental, it takes what it needs and moves on. But his influence did not move on, it calcified. The dark suit that Brummel pioneered is still in the 21st century, the default costume of male professional authority in the Western world. The power of the suit, the plain dark jacket, the white shirt, the necktie that is the direct descendant of the cravat. Brummel spent his mornings perfecting has not dimmed. Politicians wear it. Chief executives wear it. Judges wear it. It is the modern equivalent of the powdered wig, the uniform that says without saying anything explicit, "I belong to the world of things that matter." Brummel replaced one kind of elaborate performance with another. He did not end the game, he just changed the rules. And the rules he wrote, that simplicity signals mastery, that understatement outranks display, that the mark of a truly well-dressed man is invisibility rather than spectacle, those rules have shaped how Western men present themselves for over 200 years. Which means there is one final question worth asking as we begin to come toward the end of tonight's story. If the wig culture that ruled for 100 years could end in a generation, and the dark suit that replaced it could become so dominant that we barely notice it anymore, what does that tell us about the standards we are currently living inside, the ones we take for granted as natural, as permanent, as simply the way things are? We have one more part of this story to tell before we answer that, and it involves some people you might recognize: Jimi Hendrix, David Bowie, Harry Styles, and the question of whether the great masculine renunciation is slowly finally beginning to reverse. That is where we're going next. Something interesting happens when fashion survives its own era. It does not simply fade out. It does not disappear the way a fad disappears here one season and gone the next. When a fashion outlasts the world that created it, it transforms into something else entirely. It becomes costume, it becomes ceremony, it becomes symbol, and in the right circumstances it becomes something so loaded with institutional meaning that the institution itself cannot quite let go of it, even when everyone involved knows perfectly well that the original reasons for wearing it dissolved long ago. The British courtroom wig is perhaps the most vivid example of this phenomenon anywhere in the world. Right now, in courtrooms across England and Wales, there are barristers and judges going to work in white horsehair wigs, not as a joke, not as a historical performance, as the actual daily dress code of a functioning legal system in the 21st century. A full judge's bench wig handmade from horsehair and styled with the same basic silhouette that was fashionable in the 1680s costs upward of $3,000. A barrister's shorter forensic wig with its characteristic frizzed crown and 4 rows of 7 curls at the back costs several £100s, and young barristers fresh to the bar are expected to purchase one and wear it as a visible indicator of their professional membership. The tradition entered the courtroom the way everything else entered it in the 1700s simply because it was the fashion. When Charles II restored the English court in 1660 and brought French fashion back with him, lawyers began wearing wigs for the same reason everyone else in polite society was wearing them. They were simply what the well-dressed professional wore. By 1685, the wig was fully established as proper court dress. And then by the early 1800s, as we've discussed at length tonight, the wig vanished from everyday life. From the streets, from the offices, from the drawing rooms, from everywhere really except 2 specific categories of professional uniform, the coachmen and the legal profession. The coachmen eventually gave up their wigs in the 1830s, the legal profession did not. For over 2 centuries after the fashion that created it had died, the wig survived not as fashion, but as something the institution needed it to be. And what does the institution need it to be? Authority. Anonymity. The visual grammar of a legal system asserting that what happens in these rooms is different from what happens outside them. A barrister in a wig is not just a person who went to law school and passed the bar exams. They are visually an officer of a tradition that stretches back centuries, a tradition that predates living memory so completely that its origins have become almost irrelevant. The wig no longer signals wealth, or syphilis cover-up, or fashionable alignment with the French court. It signals the law itself, and the law requires that kind of visual gravity, or so the argument runs. Do you find that convincing? I find myself genuinely torn by it, because on one hand it seems almost absurd a profession wearing the physical remnant of a disease-driven 17th century fashion trend and calling it the dignity of justice. But on the other hand, I understand what happens in a room when everyone knows exactly what the clothes mean. The wig depersonalizes the individual. It makes the advocate less a person and more a function. And something about the function of law, the idea that it applies equally regardless of who is wearing it, benefits from that visual abstraction. In 2007, the United Kingdom reformed wig requirements for civil and family courts. The Supreme Court followed. But in criminal courts and in many ceremonial settings the wig remains, not required by law exactly, but so embedded in professional custom that its absence would still feel to those inside the system like something has been lost. Ghana, Zimbabwe, Kenya, former British colonies that inherited the legal system along with its dress codes, are still debating today whether to continue the tradition or abandon it. The wig born of Louis XIV's syphilitic hair loss shaped into courtly fashion by the court of Charles II is being argued over in African courtrooms in the 21st century. That is a legacy of a peculiar kind. But the courtroom is not the only place the story continued, because the great masculine renunciation that Brummel's dark suit had inaugurated the collective agreement among Western men to stop being beautiful and start being useful was never, it turns out, as complete as it seemed. It had gaps, pockets of resistance, moments where the instinct toward ornament and colour and deliberate self-decoration reasserted itself, often in precisely the settings where the social stakes of doing so were highest. Think about what Jimi Hendrix looked like when he walked onto a stage in 1967. The velvet jacket, the ruffled shirt, The hat festooned with a feather, there is a Yankee Doodle joke in there somewhere, and I suspect Hendrix would have enjoyed it. The deliberate theatricality of the presentation, the sense that the clothes were not background noise but part of the communication itself. Hendrix was not just playing music. He was performing the whole thing, the sound, the stance, the appearance, as an integrated statement. And his appearance said quite clearly the rules of the great masculine renunciation do not apply here. Music had always been one of the places the rules were most negotiable. The performance space had a different contract with the audience than the office or the courthouse. You came to watch, which meant the performer was permitted, even expected to be watched. That made room for what Bowie did in 1972, and what Bowie did in 1972 was one of the most significant cultural acts of the 20th century. Before David Bowie became Ziggy Stardust, men's rock music had developed a very specific visual vocabulary of masculinity. Denim, leather, rugged undress, the deliberate casual anti-fashion of men who were too cool to care about clothes. The aesthetic was in its own way a continuation of Brummel's original logic: the powerful man does not need to announce himself through ornament. He simply is, and his presence is enough. Bowie looked at this aesthetic and did something to it that had not been done since the Macaronis. He rejected it completely and replaced it with something that looked like nothing that had existed before an alien rock god, with Japanese kabuki-influence makeup, a fiery red mullet body-hugging jumpsuits, in colours that would have been considered aggressive, even in the 18th century, and a deliberate, total, absolutely committed blurring of every visual boundary between masculinity and femininity that the previous 150 years had carefully maintained. He later described his intention in this era as creating a vocabulary, a new kind of currency. A vocabulary that said, among other things, the categories you've been given are not the only categories. The visual language of what a man is allowed to be is not the final word on what a man can be. Ziggy Stardust debuted properly in 1972. By 1973, when Bowie performed on the BBC's Top of the Pops, he was watched by an audience of millions, many of them teenagers who had grown up inside the grey, dark, unornamented masculine world that the great masculine renunciation had created, and who felt watching this person in eyeliner and a spacesuit something shift. Camille Paglia, the feminist scholar, described Bowie's Ziggy period as having a staggering influence on her, and she was not alone. A generation of people who did not fit the available templates of masculine or feminine as the culture had defined them, suddenly had evidence that those templates were choices, not facts, that someone had made them and someone could unmake them. Now here is the historical resonance that I have been building toward and that I think deserves to be stated plainly. What Bowie was doing in 1972 was not unprecedented. It was in a very real sense a return to something that had existed before Brummel, before the great masculine renunciation, before Pitt's tax and the French Revolution, and the flower on the guillotine and all of the other forces that had combined to drain the colour from the Western male wardrobe over the course of one catastrophic decade at the end of the 18th century. He was, without quite framing it this way, rediscovering the world we've been exploring tonight, the world where men painted their faces and were taken seriously, the world where a man spent hours on his hair and then went and made decisions that changed history. The world where powder and perfume and beauty patches and elaborate, colourful theatrical self-presentation were not considered feminine or frivolous, but were recognised as what they actually were: the full deployment of a human being's capacity for self-expression directed at an audience that understood it was being communicated to. Bowie's Ziggy was not a historical reenactment, but it drew on the same instinct, the instinct that colour and artifice and deliberate visual construction are forms of power, not departures from it. And then 50 years later, Harry Styles walked the red carpet at the Met Gala in 2019, in a sheer black blouse, wide-leg trousers and pearl earrings. He appeared on the cover of Vogue in a ball gown. He wore lace and feathers and sequins to his own concerts, and became one of the most successful pop musicians in the world, partly on the strength of an aesthetic that the cultural commentators kept describing as groundbreaking, which it was in the context of mainstream pop music in the 21st century, but which was also, if you knew your history, a return to something very old. He told interviewers that he found it strange that clothing had gender at all, that a dress was just a dress, that the idea of a man in pearls being transgressive would have struck someone from the 18th century as completely bizarre. He was right, and the fact that it needed saying tells you something important about how thoroughly the great masculine renunciation had done its work. Let me ask you something personal, if that is all right. When you picture a powerful man, a genuinely powerful, respected, authoritative man, what does he look like? I am curious whether the image that comes to mind is the dark suit and the white shirt, and the plain, understated, Brummel-inherited aesthetic. Whether the absence of colour and ornament reads automatically as the presence of seriousness. I ask because I think that image, however natural it feels, was constructed, deliberately and recently in historical terms. Before Brummel, before the renunciation, a man who dressed in plain dark clothes with no adornment was not projecting authority. He was projecting the poverty of someone who could not afford better. Authority announced itself loudly, extravagantly, in silk and powder and scent and colour. The equation changed. It was changed, I would argue, partly by necessity, by the specific political and moral pressure of the revolutionary moment, and partly by the genius of one man who found a new way to communicate the same claim to superiority through restraint rather than display. But the equation is not permanent. It has changed before. It is changing again slowly in the way cultural shifts always move through music first, then through film, then through fashion, then through a creeping adjustment in what we find natural, until one day we look back at photographs from our own era and find the assumptions we never questioned suddenly visible in a way they were not before. What tonight's story has been building toward, I think, is a single observation that I want to leave with you as we move into the final chapters of our journey. The way men look has never been outside of history. It has always been an argument about power and status and identity and who gets to decide what seriousness looks like. The powdered wig was an argument. The great masculine renunciation was an argument. Bowie's Ziggy was an argument. The dark suit is an argument. Harry Styles at the Met Gala is an argument. Every generation inherits the aesthetics of the previous one and has to decide consciously or not whether to continue the argument or start a new one. And the men of the 18th century, the ones we have been following through powder rooms and perfume closets and flower riots and macaroni clubs and revolutionary Paris, made their choices with the same seriousness, the same genuine conviction, the same investment in what their appearance said about them that we bring to ours. They just had more flour in their hair. We're almost at the end of tonight's journey, and there is one last thread to pull about what this whole story finally means, about the dark industry that supplied the hair for 100 years of wigs, about the poor women who sold their locks for bread, and the convicts who could not refuse, and the plague dead whose hair Samuel Pepys feared he was wearing on his head, about the underside of the glamour that we've been circling all evening, and then finally about what a man stepping out into a world that is slowly, tentatively, cautiously rediscovering the pleasure of self-decoration might be recovering that was lost 200 years ago. That is where we are going right now. There is something we've been circling all night without looking at directly. Something that sits at the very foundation of the whole beautiful, elaborate, powder-scented world we've been exploring. Where did the hair come from? Not the powder. We know the powder came from wheat fields and potato starch. Not the perfume we know that came from flower gardens and civet cats and sperm whales. but the hair itself, the human hair. The tens of thousands of wigs that covered the heads of aristocrats and lawyers and merchants and colonial publishers across Europe and North America and beyond through a century and a half of fashion. Where did all of that hair actually come from? The answer is one of the places where the glamour of this story rubs up against something much harder and much darker, and I think it deserves to be told plainly. Because every object has a supply chain, and every fashion has an underside. By the mid-18th century, the European hair trade was booming. There is no softer way to put it. 6,000 people in Paris alone were employed in the wig industry. 1,200 shops, guilds with their own rules and quality standards, their own disputes over bleached versus natural hair, their own carefully maintained relationships with suppliers. It was a serious industrial operation, and it required a serious supply of raw material. The best wigs were made from human hair. Not horsehair, not goat hair, not the various animal fibres that could substitute at a lower price point, but actual human hair, cut from actual human heads. Preferably young, preferably healthy, preferably in the colours that the market currently favoured. White hair was the most fashionable and the hardest to find naturally, which was one of the reasons the powder system developed in the first place. Blonde and silver grey were highly sought after. Black was marketable. Naturally curly hair commanded a premium because it held its shape better and required less work from the wig maker. And where did this hair come from? Collectors, many of them from Flanders, fanned out across the European countryside, travelling from village to village with their scales and their scissors and their small amounts of coin, buying hair from the women and girls who had it. Peasant women, rural workers, young women from the lowest social classes who had almost nothing else of value that the city wanted, but who'd been growing their hair for years. They sold it in the only transaction available to them. Their labour had produced something beautiful, and the market for beauty had finally reached their village. The hair trade was not a single dramatic event. It was a quiet, persistent, systematic extraction that moved through the countryside on foot and by cart for decades. A young woman's hair grown patiently over 3 or 4 years, cut in a transaction that took 5 minutes, translated into a sum of money that might feed her family for a week, or allow her to pay a debt or purchase something she could not otherwise afford. Blonde or silver grey hair, the most fashionable, fetched the highest prices. The collectors understood the market. They knew what the wig shops in Paris and London wanted, and they priced accordingly. A girl with naturally silver hair might find herself paid considerably more than her neighbour with dark hair, not because she was worth more as a person, but because a particular court fashion had decided that her particular colouring was the correct appearance for a man of standing. I find that detail worth sitting with for a moment. The colour of a woman's hair growing on her head in a village she had probably never left was being assigned a market value by a fashion trend set by kings and courtiers in palaces she had almost certainly never seen and would never see. She was connected to Versailles by a supply chain that she did not fully understand and that did not think about her at all. She was in the language of the trader source. The convents were more reliable. In Catholic countries, France, Spain, Italy, much of the rest of continental Europe, when a young woman entered a religious order as a novice, one of the rituals of her admission was the ceremonial cutting of her hair. The act was symbolic. She was renouncing the vanity of the world, including the vanity of her own appearance. She was submitting to a new identity that had no use for the elaborate beauty standards of secular life. Her hair was cut and she covered her head, and her haircut as an act of spiritual submission was collected, not by her, not for her benefit. The hair went to the wig makers. Whether the individual convents were actively involved in the transaction, or whether the hair was simply gathered and sold by intermediaries, the result was the same: the spiritual renunciation of young women entering religious life, contributed through a commercial channel to the physical adornment of secular men displaying their wealth and status at court. There is something almost unbearably ironic about that particular loop in the supply chain. The act of giving up worldly vanity made material fed the engine of worldly vanity. And then there were the prisoners. In various points across Europe, the hair of inmates and prisoners of war was harvested and sold into the trade. This was not a hidden fact or a practice that required concealment. It was simply part of the institutional management of people who had lost in the course of their incarceration most of the rights that would have allowed them to object. Their hair grew. The institution needed money. The transaction required no consent beyond the fact that consent was not being asked for. We do not know how many wigs contained this kind of hair. We cannot trace the individual strands. The supply chains of the 18th century kept no records that would allow us to answer that question now, and even if they had, the wig itself once finished gave no indication of where its raw material had originated. A judge's ceremonial wig, a gentleman's fashionable everyday periwig, a colonial American merchant's powdered queue, the hair was the hair. It came from somewhere. Most of the time, nobody in the room was thinking about where. Most haunting of all is the plague story. Samuel Pepys, our honest, anxious, curious diarist, who we met earlier in this story buying his first wig and worrying about its fit and social implications, recorded in September of 1665 that he had bought a new periwig some time before but had not worn it because the plague had been in Westminster when he purchased it. He worried in the plain, honest way he worried about most things, that the hair in the wig might have been cut from the heads of people who had died of the plague. He was not certain. He did not know. He eventually wore it, having decided enough time had passed. But the uncertainty was real enough to be recorded, which means it was real enough to be felt. Wig hair came from wherever it could be found. By the time it reached the wigmaker's workshop, nobody was asking questions about its provenance. The market needed hair. There was always someone somewhere with hair to sell or hair that could be taken. And the product that emerged from all of this, the elegant, scented, carefully constructed object that sat on a gentleman's head, gave no sign of any of it. I want to be careful here not to be simply dark for the sake of drama. History is not a morality tale, and the people buying wigs in the 18th century were not unique in their separation from the labour that produced the things they wore and used. Every era operates this way. Every consumer culture rests on a foundation of transactions that the final consumer does not see or does not look at too closely. But I think there is something genuinely important about looking at the whole picture, because one of the things that makes the powdered wig era so compelling to me, and I hope to you, is precisely the completeness of the illusion it created. The man in the carefully styled wig, the scented powder, the perfect white complexion, the rouge and the beauty patches and the exquisite clothes, he'd arranged himself into something that looked from every available angle like the product of effortless natural superiority. Like someone who had simply arrived in the world this way, the grain in the powder, the women in the villages, the novices in the convents, the prisoners, the plague dead, or possibly the plague dead, depending on what year you bought your wig and how carefully the supplier had tracked their inventory. None of it was visible. None of it was supposed to be visible, that was the point. And then there is the specific genius and the specific tragedy of Marie Antoinette's hair, because the women we have been discussing, the women whose hair became raw material, were on one end of the vast social distance that fashion enforced, and at the other end was Versailles, where the most famous head of hair in the world was busy making political statements of its own in a language so elaborate and so entirely its own that it reads today less like hair and more like architecture. In 1778, the French frigate La Belle Poule won a naval battle against the British. It was a significant victory, the first major French maritime win against England in decades, and deeply politically charged because France was at that point involved in the American Revolutionary War, and the battle resonated with everyone who had opinions about that conflict. Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, Léonard Autier, arrived at her dressing room and proceeded to construct on the top of the Queen's head a complete, meticulously accurate scale model of the Belle Poule. Masts, rigging, tiny cannons, the ship sailing on a sea of the Queen's own powdered, undulating hair, the natural waves of her coiffure suggesting the actual movement of water. She wore it to a ball at Versailles. She wore it once. That was enough. The style was called the coiffure à la Belle Poule, and within weeks the women of Versailles, and then the women of Paris, and then fashionable women across Europe were wearing their own versions of it. Ship hairstyles, battle hairstyles, patriotic hairstyles that used the surface area of a woman's head as a canvas for political commentary. One style celebrated the inoculation of Louis XVI against smallpox, featuring an olive branch for peace and a serpent for medicine. The Duchesse de Choiseul once wore a 3-foot pouf containing a complete garden scene, flowers, grass, a tiny bubbling stream, and a miniature windmill edged with jewels powered by an actual clockwork mechanism that ticked quietly above her head as she walked through a room. These things were not wigs, they were sculptures, they were performance art. They were news commentary and political allegory, and royal propaganda and personal expression all compressed into a structure sitting on a woman's head that could weigh several pounds, reach 2 feet or more into the air, and cost more than a working family in Paris would see in months. The poufs were so tall that women had to kneel on the floor of their carriages to fit through the doorway or lean their heads out the window. When Marie Antoinette attended the Paris Opera, the director had to issue a decree that only modest poufs would be admitted under the threat of having the guards remove you, because the audience could not see the stage through the forest of elaborately constructed hairstyles blocking their view. Can I just sit with that detail for a second? The management of the Paris Opera House issuing a formal prohibition on tall hair because women in the audience were obstructing the performance with their heads. There is something in that image that is both completely absurd and somehow deeply recognizably human. The tension between the person who wants to express themselves fully and the social space that cannot quite contain the full expression. Women wore these constructions for weeks at a time, sleeping on specially designed neck blocks that kept their heads elevated so as not to crush the architecture. And because the pomade base, the beef fat and bear grease we discussed earlier, combined with the wheat starch powder and the warmth of a living scalp, created conditions that were, to put it diplomatically, hospitable to certain small creatures, elaborate head-scratching implements were kept close at hand. Long-handled silver scratchers, some of them quite beautiful, designed to slide under the superstructure without disturbing it enough to matter. In fashionable dining rooms, these scratches were sometimes laid alongside the silverware as matter of course. The rats in the hair, by the way, the famous rumour that women had actual rodents nesting in their elaborate hairstyles, are almost certainly legend. What is true is that wigmakers used a technique called ratting, which involved backcombing the hair aggressively to create volume and bulk. The phrase entered the popular vocabulary, and somewhere along the way it transformed into something more vivid and more satisfying as a story. History prefers its metaphors literal. What strikes me most about all of this, the village woman selling her hair to the collector, the novice in the convent, the prisoner, the plague victim's hair that may or may not have ended up on a gentleman's head, and Marie Antoinette with a full-rigged warship sailing across her powdered scalp, is how the same basic material human hair was operating in completely different registers of the social world simultaneously. At the bottom, a transaction of survival, invisible, unremarked. At the top, the most theatrical, most politically deliberate, most extravagantly visible act of personal expression the era had available to a woman who was in almost every other domain required to be silent. Marie Antoinette could not vote. She could not address Parliament. She could not command armies or negotiate treaties. Her formal political power was almost entirely ceremonial, but she could do something with her hair that a warship captain could not do with his navy. She could make people argue. She could make them look. She could put a political statement in a room that the room could not ignore, and that would be discussed in salons and newspapers and caricature prints for weeks. Her hair went white supposedly overnight in the prison cell before her execution. Whether that is physiologically accurate or romantic legend, the image has a weight to it that I cannot quite let go. The woman who had used her hair as a medium of expression for 2 decades, who had built ships and gardens and pastoral scenes in it, who had spent 4,000 livres on hair products in a single year, whose coiffures had been lampooned and admired and copied and condemned across an entire continent, that woman sitting in a prison cell and her hair changing. History sometimes provides its own endings. We have been in this story for a long time now. Through powder rooms and plague fears and wig thieves and flower riots and the dark industry that kept the whole thing running, through the courts of Versailles and the courtrooms of London and the hair trade routes of Flanders. And I want to tell you something before we reach the final part of tonight's journey. Everything we have discussed, the vanity, the beauty, the industry, the suffering embedded in the supply chain, the political statement and the political disaster, all of it was human. Recognizably, intimately, completely human. The same impulses that drove a king to hire 48 wig makers and a court to build ships in their hair are the same impulses that drive any person in any era to care deeply about how they appear to the world. The question of who we present ourselves as, and what that presentation costs and who bears that cost, and whether the beauty we create is worth the full weight of what created it, that question did not belong to the 18th century. It belongs to every morning in front of every mirror. And with that thought sitting quietly in the room with us, there is one last thing I want to tell you about what this whole story finally means, about what was gained and what was lost when the wig ended, about why perhaps the story of powder and perfume and pride is not a story about the past at all. That is where we are going now, to the last place in our journey. We have travelled a long way tonight, from the gilded bedchamber of Louis XIV, where 100 people gathered every morning to watch a king be dressed, through the powder rooms and the plague fears and the wig thieves hiding in baskets, through the women in the villages who sold their hair to collectors on cart roads, through the flower riots and the revolution, and the guinea pigs of William Pitt's hair tax, through Beau Brummell's cravat and the dark suit that followed, through Bowie's eyeliner and the boys who laughed outside the courthouse and Justice Cushing's abandoned wig, through the ships in Marie Antoinette's hair and the convents and the plague dead and everything else that fed the beautiful, terrible machine. We have come a long way, and I want to end not in the 18th century but right here, in the world we're actually living in. Here is a number that I think is remarkable. In a survey conducted in 2023 by the research firm Mintel, 72% of American men between the ages of 18 and 34 reported that they currently use cosmetic products as part of their grooming routine. Not just face wash, not just deodorant, cosmetics. Products designed to alter or enhance their appearance. Concealers, tinted moisturizers, brow gels, serums. Products that 200 years ago the great masculine renunciation declared were no longer appropriate for men, 72%. From virtually zero in the early 20th century, from a world in which a man who wore cosmetics was considered either theatrical suspect or deeply eccentric, to 72% of young American men in the space of a few decades. The global male grooming market, including color cosmetics and skincare, is projected to reach somewhere between $200 and $300 billion by the end of this decade. Men's beauty spending grew at nearly 10% in 2024, outpacing women's spending by almost double the rate. Searches for men's makeup tutorials on social platforms rose 80% during recent lockdown periods, as men at home with more time and fewer social audiences to perform for quietly started experimenting with the things they had perhaps always been curious about. Something is changing. Something that feels from where I am sitting like a tide that has been out for 200 years and is quietly, tentatively beginning to come back in. I want to be careful not to overstate this. The great masculine renunciation did not happen in a decade, and it will not fully reverse in one either. The dark suit is not going anywhere. The man in eyeliner at the office is still in most offices doing something that requires a degree of personal confidence that not everyone has access to. The social costs of departing from the inherited visual grammar of masculinity are real, and they fall unevenly, and they are not trivial. But the direction of travel is visible, and it is visible, I think, partly because the history we have been discussing tonight is becoming more widely known and discussed, because more people are understanding that the particular equation between plainness and seriousness, between the absence of adornment and the presence of authority, is not a law of nature, it is a cultural agreement, struck at a specific moment in history for specific reasons, and like all cultural agreements available for renegotiation. John Flugel, the psychologist who named the Great Masculine Renunciation in 1930, said that men had abandoned their claim to be considered beautiful, and henceforth aimed at being only useful. He said it as a description, not a prescription. But he also in the same passage wondered aloud whether this abandonment had cost men something, whether the very completeness of the renunciation, the wholeness of the surrender of ornament and colour and visible self-pleasure in appearance, had produced a kind of psychological deprivation that nobody was quite willing to name. I think he was right, and I think the numbers we are seeing now, the 72%, the $100 billion market, the Gen Z men who do not understand why a face wash should be gendered, suggest that the deprivation is being noticed, and quietly, experimentally, without a great deal of fanfare being addressed. What does this have to do with the men in their powder rooms, the wigs and the patches and the perfumed fountains? Everything, and I mean that quite literally. The men of the 18th century were not the first men in human history to care about their appearance, and they were not the last. But they occupied a particular and now nearly forgotten position in the long arc of masculine self-presentation. They were the last generation in the Western world, at least for whom it was simply understood without argument or apology that a man of substance and seriousness attended to his appearance with the same deliberate care he brought to his politics and his correspondence and his management of the estate. They did not choose between looking good and being important. The two were not in tension. They were the same thing expressed through different means. When we look at those portraits now at Louis XIV in his magnificent wig, or at the Duke of Bedford in the painting where Brummel famously picked up his lapel and asked whether he called that a coat, we see something that looks to our eyes like excess or vanity or perhaps comedy. But what the men in those portraits would have found genuinely strange is our surprise, our sense that caring about how you look requires some kind of justification, that it is something to apologize for or explain or frame carefully as not really vanity, it is actually confidence. They would not have understood that anxiety. And I think slowly we're beginning to understand that we should not have it either. Let me tell you one last story before we close. When the French Revolution was finally over, when the guillotine had quieted, and Napoleon had risen, and the visual world of the Ancien Regime had been decisively, irreversibly replaced, there was a period of extraordinary social confusion about what fashionable young men were supposed to look like. Some threw themselves into military swagger. Some adopted the Brummel-esque dark suit with genuine conviction. But some, the ones history recorded with a particular kind of amused astonishment, went in an entirely different direction. They styled their hair in strange unkempt configurations. that referenced the hairstyles of people who'd been sent to the guillotine. They wore extravagant cravats tied so high and so tight that they could barely turn their heads. They affected a particular walk, a particular posture, a particular air of bored theatricality that was in its own way as elaborate and as conscious as anything Louis XIV's court had ever produced. They were called the Incroyables, the Incredibles, and their message was not entirely unlike the message Bowie would carry 200 years later in a different medium. The categories you have been handed are not the only categories. The way it was before is not the way it has to be. The rules are not natural laws and we are not obligated to follow them. Fashion at its best has always been this, not frivolity, not vanity in the shallow sense, but argument. The ongoing, sometimes gorgeous, sometimes ridiculous, always human argument about who we are and who we are allowed to be. So here is where I want to leave you tonight. The next time you stand in front of a mirror, whether you're reaching for a comb or a concealer or a bottle of perfume, or simply a suit that fits the way Brummel intended I want you to remember something, you're standing at the end of a very long conversation that has involved kings and wig makers and plague-dead and revolutionary peasants, and a man in car who died forgotten and penniless, and still managed to change what men have worn to work for the last 200 years. You're in the most literal sense wearing history. Every choice you make about your appearance is made inside a set of assumptions that were constructed, argued over, revised, taxed, revolted against, and passed down to you by people who cared about these things at least as much as you do, and probably more. That does not mean you have to care the same way they did. You do not need to powder anything. The macaroni wig is probably not making a mainstream comeback, but it does mean that the anxiety some men still carry about caring too much about how they look. The ghost of the idea that serious men do not attend to surfaces is not ancient wisdom. It is a 200-year-old fashion decision that got promoted to a law of nature. And like most things that get promoted beyond their station, it does not quite hold up when you look at it directly. The gentlemen in the powder rooms knew something that we are slowly circuitously remembering, that to present yourself to the world with care and intention is not vanity. It is respect. For yourself, for the people you are meeting, for the conversation that appearances always inevitably conduct in every room you enter. Wear what you mean, and mean what you wear. And with that, with the smell of orris root and lavender fading in the air, and the ghost of powdered wigs dissolving back into 2 centuries of history, and the story finally gently coming to rest, I want to thank you. Not just for staying with me tonight through all the Baroque complexity and the dark supply chains and the Yankee Doodle jokes and the rats in the hair that were not actual rats, but for being the kind of person who wants to understand where things came from, who finds the question of why the world looks the way it does worth spending a few hours exploring, who can hear the story of a syphilis-driven fashion trend and find in it something genuinely moving about human vanity and human dignity, and the long, strange, beautiful conversation that civilization has been having with itself about what it means to look like who you are. That is exactly the kind of curiosity that makes these stories worth telling. If tonight's journey meant something to you, if some part of it surprised you or moved you, or made you think of something you had not thought about before, please leave a comment below. Tell me which part stayed with you. Tell me what you thought about differently after tonight. Those messages are the reason these stories get made, and every single one of them is read. If you enjoyed tonight, a like helps this story find the people it was meant to find. And if you want to know when the next journey is ready, because there is always a next journey, and it is always somewhere you have not quite been, before subscribing ensures you will not miss it when it arrives. The lights can stay soft a little longer. Let tonight's story settle where it has landed, and when you are ready, I will be here with the next one. Sleep well.